Propaganda doesn't mean lies. Most people think propaganda means lies, bold, obvious lies. The kind you'd laugh at if you saw them today, posters from dictatorships, fake news broadcasts, war slogans shouting in red letters. But that's not how propaganda really works. At least not the kind you've actually fallen for. The most effective propaganda isn't made of lies. It's made of truth, carefully selected, framed, and repeated until the truth becomes a weapon. Here's how it works. You don't tell people what to think. You control what they think about. You don't say 2 + 2 = 5. You just talk about how dangerous the other number is. You flood the conversation with fear, moral urgency, and certainty. And most people will never even notice what's been left out. That's what makes propaganda dangerous. It isn't fake news, it's strategic truth. A photo taken at just the right moment. A quote with the beginning and end trimmed off. A statistic without its context. It's the choice of which stories to tell and which to bury. Think about war reporting. If you're in one country you see brave soldiers and heroic efforts, switch the channel or the country, and the same footage shows reckless violence, innocent victims, moral failure. Both sides are using real events, just arranged differently. That's not an accident. Edward Bernays, one of the fathers of modern propaganda, once said, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." He didn't think that was a bad thing. He thought it was necessary. He helped sell cigarettes to women by calling them torches of freedom. He made bacon and eggs a traditional American breakfast by paying off doctors. He understood that you don't need to lie. You just need to wrap a message in values, identity, and emotion. That's what today's propaganda does. In governments, in advertising, in schools, in algorithms. It doesn't come with a warning label. It comes as a TikTok, a slogan, a textbook chapter, something that sounds normal, reasonable, true. And that's the trap, because if you think propaganda is only something other people fall for, the uneducated, the weak-minded, the people in the past, then it's already working on you. The moment you believe you're immune to it, you're vulnerable. Because real propaganda doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like common sense. You were born into a story, not reality. Before you learned how to walk, before you understood what a word meant, someone was already telling you a story about who you are. You were told where you belong, what's good, what's evil, what's normal. You were handed a name, a language, a nation, a religion, all long before you had the ability to question any of it. By the time you were old enough to think for yourself, most of yourself had already been built. That's not an accident. That's the point. Propaganda doesn't begin with media. It begins with meaning. You weren't born into reality. You were born into a preloaded narrative, a culturally constructed lens, carefully curated to feel natural. Everything you learned, history, morality, your identity, came pre-framed. You didn't choose your belief system. You were born inside one. Let's break that down. Take countries. Most people have strong emotional attachments to their homeland, but a country isn't a physical object. It's an idea, a border on a map drawn by someone else. And yet people will kill or die for it. Why? Because from childhood, we're fed stories about our people, our heroes, our enemies, national anthems, flag rituals, war holidays. Patriotism isn't a fact, it's a story. And it works best when no one notices it's a story. Same with religion. Most believers follow the religion of their parents, not because they weighed all the world's faiths and chose the best one, but because it was presented as truth before they could say no. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, you probably believe in Islam. If you were born in rural Utah, it's probably Mormonism. That's not reason. That's cultural scripting. And the scripts go deeper. What do you think is success? A family? A job? A house? Who defined that? Why do some cultures see independence as maturity, while others see it as selfishness? Why are some feelings called sins in one story, but liberation in another? This isn't just cultural, it's structural. Every institution, school, media, religion, law, reinforces the narrative, not always with lies, often with stories, with repetition, with silence. The most powerful beliefs don't require force, just early exposure and the illusion that everyone agrees. And the longer you live inside a narrative, the harder it is to see it. You don't question the water when you're the fish. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre once said that humans are storytelling animals. We can't make sense of ourselves without a plot, without villains and heroes, beginnings and endings, purpose and meaning. And that need for narrative is exactly what makes us vulnerable. Because once someone gives you a story about your place in the world, your duty, your history, they don't have to control your choices. They only have to control the frame. And if you're living inside a frame, you won't see it. You'll just call it reality. Common sense is a script. What do you think of when you hear the phrase common sense? Most people imagine something grounded, reasonable, the obvious truths of life that don't need explaining. Don't walk into traffic. Don't trust a stranger with your bank account. If it rains, bring a coat. We think of common sense as the solid ground underneath all the debates and confusion. But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Common sense is not universal. It's not timeless. It's not neutral. It's a script, written by a culture, repeated by institutions, and enforced by emotion. You didn't invent your version of it. You inherited it, and now you defend it without even realizing. Let's take one of the most sacred pieces of common sense in the modern world. Hard work leads to success. It sounds self-evident. Of course it does. You've been hearing it since you were 5. In school, students who follow the rules and work hard get stars, praise, and better grades. You're taught that effort equals reward. But in reality, this equation breaks down fast. Working 3 jobs doesn't lift you out of poverty. Inherited wealth can catapult you past someone far more skilled. You can spend decades grinding and still end up invisible. But if someone points that out, what do we say? They just didn't try hard enough. The myth survives, not because it fits reality, but because it fits the script. It just feels right. It's been rehearsed too many times to question. This isn't new. In the 1800s, it was common sense that women were naturally unfit for politics. They were ruled by emotion, too delicate, too irrational. That wasn't considered bigotry. It was obvious. Everyone knew. There were articles, doctors, teachers all confirming it. Women weren't angry about being denied rights. They were reassured that this was just nature's way. In apartheid South Africa, it was common sense that the races should be kept apart. In medieval Europe, it was common sense that kings ruled by divine right. In ancient Rome, it was common sense that some people were born to be slaves. These weren't fringe views. These were the foundations of daily life. That's what common sense does. It hides ideology inside familiarity. And when something becomes just the way things are, it no longer needs to be defended. It becomes invisible, like the air in your lungs or the street signs you no longer read. This is what makes it a propaganda tool. Because once a belief is labeled common sense, you don't have to argue for it anymore. You just dismiss anything else as naive, extreme, or dangerous. In the early 2000s, the phrase tough on crime was treated as common sense in U.S. politics. Mandatory minimums, stop and frisk, 3-strike laws. The logic was simple. More punishment equals more safety. But no one mentioned the explosion of the prison population, the racial disparities, the lives erased. To question it was to sound soft, irrational, out of touch, because the script had already been written. Even now, listen to phrases like, boys will be boys, there's no free lunch. That's just human nature. These aren't arguments. They're pre-cooked conclusions, shortcuts designed to end thought before it begins. The philosopher Antonio Gramsci called this cultural hegemony, when the ruling ideas of a society are so normalized that they feel like facts of life. Not because they are true, but because they've been repeated in schools, news, sitcoms, ads, family dinners, everywhere you look. The real question isn't what's common sense, it's who benefits when you believe it. Your morals are pre-installed. You believe murder is wrong. You believe stealing is wrong. Torture, child abuse, betrayal, wrong. You don't need to be told that. It feels obvious, natural, built into the structure of reality. But it's not. It's built into you by other people. Morality doesn't emerge from reason. It comes from exposure, from imitation, from obedience. Long before understanding, you were trained into it. And the proof is simple. Your sense of right and wrong changes completely depending on the context you're raised in. Let's take something simple, lying. In modern Western culture, lying is morally wrong, at least in theory. It's punished, discouraged, associated with weakness or criminality. But in Confucian moral philosophy, lying to preserve social harmony or protect a family member isn't a moral failure, it's a duty. In certain tribal societies, withholding truth from outsiders is a mark of loyalty. The same act, completely different moral interpretation. Now zoom out. For most of recorded history, slavery was legal and morally acceptable in almost every society. Aristotle called it natural. Ancient Rome depended on it. So did the United States. Not that long ago, were all those people born evil? No. They were born inside moral frameworks that normalized horror, just like we are. Today we look back with disgust and assume we've evolved, that our modern sense of justice, equality, human rights is the final stage of moral progress. But that's what every age thinks. The Romans thought they were civilized. The Puritans thought they were righteous. The Nazis thought they were purifying the world, and we think we're the ones who finally got it right. That's not moral superiority. That's moral amnesia. The philosopher Nietzsche warned us about this. He said that morality isn't handed down from some higher source. It's a social invention. The strong invent one morality. The weak invent another. What we call good is usually just whatever protects the current structure of power. And once enough people believe in it, it stops feeling like ideology and starts feeling like truth. This is where propaganda gets dangerous. Because propaganda doesn't just tell you what to believe, it rewires what feels right. And once morality is hijacked, no resistance is needed. People will police themselves. They'll shame, punish, and destroy others, and feel good doing it, righteous even. That's why people cheer for war, why children turn in their parents, why torture becomes enhanced interrogation, because it doesn't feel evil when it's framed as moral. Most people don't wake up and ask, what's true? They wake up and ask, what's normal? And if something is normal long enough, it becomes moral. And if it's moral long enough, it becomes invisible. Your disgust, your outrage, your conscience, none of it is immune. Because morality isn't some eternal law you tap into like a cosmic Wi-Fi signal. It's installed, line by line, by family, by school, by repetition, by reward and punishment, and by the time you're old enough to question it, you don't want to. Because by then, your morality isn't just your belief, it's your identity. The illusion of free thought. You probably believe your thoughts are your own, that your opinions formed through experience, reason, and reflection. Question that even if you've been influenced, you still chose what to believe. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't control your thoughts. You rationalize them. Let's start with a simple test. What are your views on immigration, abortion, taxes, AI, climate change? You probably have an answer for each, sometimes even passionate ones. But where did those answers come from? Did you study the data, read every opposing argument, or did you absorb them from the world around you and then work backward to justify them? Because that's what humans do. We don't reason our way into beliefs. We inherit them, and then reason around them. Cognitive scientists have a term for this: motivated reasoning. Once we want something to be true, Whether it's because of loyalty, identity, fear, or comfort, we start filtering evidence to support it. Anything that fits gets in. Anything that doesn't gets dismissed, mocked, or ignored. And the entire process happens automatically, below conscious awareness. This is how two people can look at the same event, a protest, a trial, a speech, and come away with opposite conclusions. They're not lying. They're not stupid. Their beliefs filtered reality before it even reached them. Now add another layer. Social reinforcement. Your opinions aren't floating in a vacuum. They're shaped by who you want to be and who you want to avoid becoming. Beliefs signal tribe, status, intelligence, morality. The wrong opinion isn't just inconvenient, it's socially dangerous. So what do? You adapt. You become fluent in the beliefs of your peers. You internalize the values of your group, and eventually you can't even tell the difference between what you believe and what you perform. That's not freedom. That's conditioning. Here's how deep it goes. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo ran the Stanford prison experiment. Students were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners. Within days, the guards began abusing the prisoners, not because they were evil, but because they had internalized a role. The costume, the environment, the authority. It rewired their behavior. Their thoughts changed to fit the frame. Most people assume they would resist, but most people are wrong. Belief is a product of environment. Put you in the right conditions, new social norms, repeated cues, enough pressure, and your most sacred thoughts will bend. Still think you're thinking freely. Here's one more twist. You don't control what enters your mind. Thoughts just appear. You don't choose them. You notice them. Try to predict your next thought. You can't. It arises uninvited. Then you take credit for it. The philosopher Schopenhauer once said, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." You can decide between two options, but you can't decide what you want to want. And if you didn't choose your desires, how free are you really? So here's the paradox. You feel like a free thinker. But you were shaped by forces you didn't choose, exposed to ideas you didn't select, trained by systems you didn't design, and now operate inside a mind that filters reality before you even see it. Free thought. It's a beautiful myth, and you were taught to believe in it. Beliefs can be implanted. Beliefs feel internal, deep, personal. They seem to emerge from experience, reflection, instinct. We talk about my beliefs, the way we talk about my childhood, as something we own. But beliefs can be implanted, not just influenced, installed, like software, deliberately. And most people won't notice it happened. Let's start with a simple fact from psychology. You don't believe things because they're true. You believe them because they've been rehearsed in your mind. The more a thought is repeated, the more fluent it becomes, easier to recall, more familiar, more comfortable. And your brain mistakes fluency for truth. This is called the illusion of truth effect. In one famous study, participants were shown a list of random statements, like the Atlantic Ocean is the largest ocean on Earth. Even when told some of the statements were false, people were more likely to believe them later if they had heard them before. Familiarity breeds credibility, regardless of accuracy. Advertisers know this. Politicians know this. Propagandists have known it for centuries. But belief implantation goes even deeper. Take a disturbing example: false memory experiments. In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed how easy it is to make people believe they experienced something that never happened, just by suggestion. Participants were told stories from their childhood, including one that was entirely fake, getting lost in a shopping mall. A significant number of them not only believed it, they added details. The memory felt real. Belief doesn't require truth. It requires emotional plausibility and social reinforcement. Now apply this to mass belief. In Nazi Germany, the phrase "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," one people, one empire, one leader, was repeated in speeches, posters, films, school books. Not because it meant anything deep, but because repetition bypasses resistance. Once a phrase lives in your head, it starts shaping your emotional landscape, and when belief becomes habit, it becomes invisible. Governments have used this technique for decades. During the Cold War, the CIA ran Operation Mockingbird, feeding pre-written stories to journalists to shape public opinion. Some stories were lies, others were real, but strategically chosen to guide beliefs toward fear, trust, loyalty, or hostility. You don't have to force people to believe. You just have to control the environment they believe within. Repeat the same message. Surround it with emotional cues. Danger, pride, disgust, loyalty. Associate it with identity. And before long, people start defending the belief as if they came to it on their own. But here's the scariest part. The process doesn't feel artificial. It feels natural, internal, because once a belief is implanted, your mind builds a narrative around it. You connect it to past experiences, values, relationships. You create reasons after you've already accepted it. And that's why belief implantation is so dangerous. Because once a belief is inside you, you become the one who defends it. You become the propagandist. The implanted idea grows roots, and then it starts to grow branches, and by the time you wonder where it came from, it feels like it's always been there. Language thinks for you. You think in a language. And that's the trap. Language doesn't just express thought, it structures it. Before you ever speak, language has already chosen what you can notice, what you can describe, and what you can even imagine. You don't see the world as it is. You see it through grammar, vocabulary, categories, and metaphors, all inherited. That's why language is one of propaganda's sharpest tools. Not because it tells you what to think, but because it quietly sets the limits of what can be thought. Consider this. In English, we have one word for snow. In Inuit languages, there are over 50. To someone raised speaking English, snow is snow. But to someone who grew up distinguishing between slushy snow, crusty snow, wind-packed snow, and dry powder, the world literally appears more textured. Not metaphorically, perceptually. They don't just describe more, they see more. This is known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language shapes perception. It doesn't just describe your thoughts, it defines the boundaries of what thoughts are available. If your language has no word for privacy, or guilt, or freedom, those ideas become harder to grasp, harder to feel, maybe even impossible. Now think about political language. In the US, poor people aren't poor, they're economically disadvantaged. Bombs don't kill civilians, they produce collateral damage. Torture isn't torture, it's enhanced interrogation. Each phrase smooths over violence. Each relabeling pushes the horror one step further from conscious recognition. You're not being lied to, you're being reframed. This is the logic behind Orwell's Newspeak in 1984. The goal wasn't just to suppress dissent, it was to eliminate the concept of dissent. If there's no word for rebellion, how do you rebel? If there's no word for injustice, how do you feel it? Orwell understood that when you shrink language, you shrink thought. Control vocabulary, control imagination. Corporations do this too. Layoffs become streamlining. Surveillance becomes data collection. Every time you accept the euphemism, your brain accepts the frame. And once a frame becomes normal, it stops looking like propaganda. It starts sounding like common sense. This goes deeper. Studies show that even grammar can shift thinking. In English, we say she broke the vase. In Spanish, the phrasing might be closer to the vase broke itself. The result, English speakers are more likely to assign blame. Spanish speakers are more likely to describe the event. The language subtly programs a sense of cause and responsibility, and it happens without conscious awareness. This means your sense of justice, your emotional responses, your moral intuitions, even the way you explain the past, are all shaped by the architecture of your native tongue. You didn't choose it, you inherited it, and now it thinks for you. Here's the twist, even your resistance to manipulation happens inside language. You can try to question your beliefs, interrogate your thoughts, but the very tools you use to do that are linguistic. You're trapped inside the very structure you're trying to escape. Repetition is brainwashing. Repetition doesn't just create belief, it creates obedience. Think about a school pledge. Every morning, a group of children, many too young to spell the words, stand, face a flag, and recite a promise they didn't write, don't understand, and never agreed to. Why? Not to inform, not to persuade, but to rehearse identity. Because repetition isn't just cognitive, it's ritual. And rituals don't require understanding. They require repetition. This is why religions repeat prayers. Why militaries march in formation. Why totalitarian regimes demand the same chants, the same posters, the same phrases shouted in unison. Not to convince your mind, but to train your body, to enforce structure, to internalize submission. You're not just repeating words, you're rehearsing allegiance. In 1978, the cult leader Jim Jones didn't just brainwash his followers through belief. He used repetition as a tool of control. Members were required to repeat phrases daily. We love you, Father. Father knows best. These weren't persuasive arguments. They were loops, linguistic handcuffs. The more they repeated, the less they questioned, until they were willing to drink poison on command. Psychologists call this compliance through commitment. Once you've performed an action publicly, repeatedly, it becomes harder to break away, not because you're convinced, but because you're trapped in your role. The philosopher Michel Foucault explored this in his analysis of prisons, schools, and hospitals. He argued that modern power isn't loud, it's subtle, it doesn't punish disobedience, it trains obedience, it turns repetition into normalization. Once the behavior is automatic, no one has to enforce it. You enforce it on yourself. Social media uses this too, not by force, but by rhythm. Likes, scrolls, hashtags. TikTok sounds repeated across millions of videos. The same trend, the same tone, the same behavior, until individuality collapses into choreography. And here's the part people miss. You don't have to believe the ritual to be shaped by it. Even ironic repetition, jokes, memes, sarcastic hashtags, reinforces structure. You play along, even while laughing, and slowly, the ritual becomes muscle memory. The best lies are 90% true. A good lie is simple. A great lie is invisible. The most effective lies aren't made of nonsense. They're made of almost truths. Facts with edges trimmed off, context removed, timing altered. Because the best lies don't confront you, they comfort you. They feel just true enough not to trigger resistance. That's how belief bypasses reason. During World War I, British propagandists spread the story that German soldiers were bayoneting Belgian babies. Newspapers ran with it. Politicians repeated it. The public was outraged. The enemy had become inhuman, evil beyond redemption. After the war, investigations found the story was almost entirely fabricated. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The emotional truth had replaced the factual one. That's how wartime propaganda often works. You tell just enough of the truth to get someone leaning in, and then you slide the rest through the door. This technique didn't disappear. It just evolved. Modern PR campaigns, for example, don't lie about what a product is. They simply reframe what it means. A car isn't sold as a machine. It's sold as freedom. Cigarettes weren't advertised as safe. They were wrapped in glamour, confidence, rebellion. All technically true if you squint. But the truth has been hollowed out, dressed up, and weaponized. It's the same with political language. Consider this phrase, "We're bringing freedom to the region." It sounds noble, unquestionable. But what does freedom mean? For whom? From what? The phrase is vague enough to pass as truth, but specific enough to justify war. That ambiguity is strategic. Linguist Noam Chomsky called this manufacturing consent. You don't suppress truth, you bury it inside a fog of almost truths. half facts, emotional symbols, reassuring stories. People don't investigate, they resonate, and belief forms before reflection ever starts. And this isn't just external. You do it to yourself. When you justify staying in a toxic relationship, when you convince yourself that your job matters, even if it drains your soul, when you repeat mantras like everything happens for a reason, even when no reason appears. You don't need a lie, you need enough truth to stop looking for one. And here's the real danger. Partial truth is harder to dislodge than a full lie. If someone tells you the moon is made of cheese, you laugh. If someone tells you the government is helping while quietly stripping your rights, it's harder to push back because part of it feels right. Propaganda knows this. Censorship isn't the main weapon anymore. Flooding the zone with curated facts, repeated stories, emotional anchors, that's what works now. Not to deceive you with absurdity, to drown you in plausibility. Because when a lie is 90% true, you don't question it. You finish it for them. Your emotions aren't yours. There's a trick that propaganda never talks about, because it doesn't need to. It's not about lies. It's not about censorship. It's about something far more intimate. Your feelings. You were trained to feel what you feel. Not because someone sat you down and gave you emotional rules, but because you were born into a world already saturated with emotional associations. Some things made the people around you cheer. Others made them fall silent. You saw the patterns. You learned what deserved anger, what deserved shame, what should fill you with pride. And slowly you began to feel it too, long before you could explain why. We think of emotion as private, internal, ours. But it's not. Emotion is scripted, it's cultural, it's historical. And most disturbingly, it's programmable. Let's make it real. Imagine two people looking at the exact same image, a national flag waving over a battlefield. One sees freedom, honor, sacrifice. The other sees occupation, violence, control. The flag doesn't change, but the emotional payload it carries is entirely different because those feelings were installed like code through repetition, ritual, and narrative. This isn't metaphorical, it's how the brain works. Through a process called classical conditioning, your nervous system learns to associate emotional responses with specific sights, sounds, symbols. The first time you heard a national anthem, you probably didn't feel anything. But over time, paired with school ceremonies, sports victories, and speeches about heroes, it gained weight. Now it triggers emotion automatically. Not because you chose it, because you were trained into it. This is why regimes don't just tell stories, they build emotional maps. The leader isn't just a person, he's father. The outsider isn't just different, he's dirty, dangerous, corrupting. These aren't descriptions, they're effective commands. You don't process them rationally, you feel them, you obey them. Propaganda is most effective not when it convinces you to think something, but when it teaches you to feel something before you think. Because once emotion gets there first, thought becomes a prisoner of justification. It's how governments justify war, not with logic, but with fear. If we don't strike first, they will. It's how movements create loyalty, not with arguments, but with guilt. If you don't stand with us, you're part of the problem. It's how identity becomes sacred, not with reasons, but with love. This is who we are. And over time, those emotions become armor. You start defending your feelings as if they were facts. You stop hearing disagreement as difference and start feeling it as threat. Not because you're irrational, but because you were conditioned to protect the emotional frame. It goes even deeper. You've been taught what sadness is supposed to look like, what joy should sound like, what shame feels like in your chest. These aren't just chemical states, they're cultural performances, emotional roles passed down like family heirlooms. This is why emotional manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like morality, like conviction, like clarity. Because once your feelings have been written by someone else, you'll never realize you're reading from a script. The algorithm is a brain surgeon. You probably think of an algorithm as a tool, a machine behind the screen, something that helps you find what you're already looking for, a restaurant, a video, a playlist. But that's not how it works anymore. An algorithm doesn't follow your brain. It rewires it. Let's start simple. Open any app, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. It doesn't matter. You scroll. Something catches your eye. You pause. The app tracks that pause. It shows you something similar next time. You pause again. The algorithm learns. It feeds you more tighter, faster, more tailored. Soon you're not choosing what to see. You're being trained to want what you're shown. And the more you engage, the less the algorithm reflects who you are, and the more it creates who you become. That's not exaggeration. It's behavioral design. Back in the early 2010s, Facebook ran an experiment on nearly 700,000 users without telling them. They manipulated users' news feeds, showing some more positive content, others more negative. The result? People's emotional expressions changed based on the tone of what they were shown. They literally caught moods from the feed. It was called emotional contagion, and it proved something chilling. Your feelings aren't entirely yours when the feed is curating your reality. But it doesn't stop with emotion. In 2021, YouTube's recommendation algorithm was found to be pushing conspiracy theories, extremist content, and polarizing videos, even when users didn't seek them out. Not because YouTube was evil, because rage, fear, and certainty get clicks. They hold attention. They create loyalty. The algorithm doesn't care what's true. It cares what's sticky. And here's the terrifying part. You don't know it's happening. You think you're browsing, exploring, following curiosity. But the pathways have already been paved, and they're narrowing every day. That's what philosopher Byung-Chul Han means when he says we've moved from a disciplinary society to a control society, where the panopticon of the prison guard has been replaced by self-optimizing subjects, nudged gently but relentlessly by machines that never sleep. You're not being forced to believe anything. You're just being shown and shown and shown until belief becomes automatic. You're not clicking. You're being clicked. Even your politics aren't safe. Cambridge Analytica, a now defunct political consulting firm, harvested data from millions of Facebook profiles to build psychological models. They didn't just target users with political ads. They tailored the tone, emotion, and timing of the message based on personality types. Angry introverts got different propaganda than anxious extroverts. It wasn't mass persuasion. It was individualized mental invasion. The goal wasn't just to change your vote. It was to shape your perception of reality, so you couldn't even imagine voting differently. That's why the algorithm isn't neutral. It's not showing you the world. It's constructing the version of the world you're allowed to see. And unlike propaganda of the past, posters, radio, state speeches, today's feed is invisible, personalized, quiet. You don't know what you're missing. You don't see what someone else is seeing. You can't compare notes with the person next to you because the machines have decided you shouldn't be looking at the same things. It doesn't need to convince you, it just needs to surround you, because when an algorithm becomes the lens through which you experience everything, it no longer has to tell you what to believe. It becomes your belief. Headlines are memory control. You probably don't remember most of the news articles you've read, but you remember the headlines. That's not a failure of memory. That's how it's designed. Headlines aren't summaries. They're scripts, not just for what you think, but for how you remember. Let's start with the basics. Studies in cognitive psychology show that when people read a headline, it shapes their interpretation of everything that follows. And even if the article later corrects or complicates the story, most readers still remember the emotional framing from the headline, not the details. This is known as the primacy effect. The first impression becomes the anchor. Everything else gets filtered through it. And when the headline is emotionally charged, the anchor hardens. The brain tags it as important, stores it in long-term memory, and links it to identity. But it gets darker. Once a headline is read, even if the article is never opened, the memory still forms. Just seeing it in passing, in your newsfeed, on a trending bar, in someone else's retweet, creates false familiarity. The idea feels known, repeated enough, it feels true, and eventually, it becomes part of what you just know. This is why propaganda doesn't need to publish lies. It only needs to write headlines. During the Iraq War, newspapers repeatedly ran with the headline, "Weapons of Mass Destruction Found." Later corrections were buried. The details were complex, but the emotional story stuck. Polls years later showed that a majority of Americans still believed Saddam had WMDs because they remembered the headline, not the retraction. Now think about your daily scroll. New study shows shocking cancer risk. Experts warn of threat from migrants. Billionaire vows to save free speech. Each headline is a frame, a mini-story with a villain, a fear, a promise. Most people don't click. They don't read. They don't investigate. But the feeling lands. And over time, that emotional architecture becomes the scaffolding of belief. Even more disturbing, headlines don't just shape memory. They erase it. In fast media cycles, today's headline overwrites yesterday's reality. It doesn't matter if a story was proven false or if new evidence changes everything. The brain discards nuance in favor of narrative. And headlines supply the narrative, one fragment at a time. By the end of the week, you're not remembering facts. You're remembering impressions. And if you believe that this only applies to tabloid readers or the uneducated, think again. In a 2014 study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, participants, including highly literate ones, were shown misleading headlines, followed by factual articles. Even after reading the full article, their memory was biased toward the headline's message. In other words, the headline quietly won. This is why headlines are the front line of modern propaganda, because attention is scarce. Time is short. People are overwhelmed. And whoever controls the first few words controls the emotional map of the information space. This isn't just a media problem, it's a memory problem, because you don't remember what happened. You remember how it was headlined. The sound of authority. Sometimes propaganda doesn't speak through what is said. It speaks through how it's said. The tone, the voice, the font, the lighting, the background music, the pace, the pauses, the confidence, all of it wraps around the message, not to support it, but to override your defenses before the message even arrives. We think persuasion happens through logic, but authority happens through presence, and presence is manufactured. Let's start with voice. In countless studies, people rate deeper voices as more trustworthy, more competent, more authoritative, even when the content is identical. A researcher at Duke University found that CEOs with lower-pitched voices tended to run larger companies and receive higher salaries. Why? Because our brains evolved to associate vocal depth with confidence and leadership, even if it's completely unrelated to truth. That same effect is used in newsrooms and state broadcasts. The anchor voice isn't an accident. It's trained, measured, smoothed to eliminate doubt. You don't just hear the facts. You feel the confidence. You're being carried, not informed. Now add visual cues. When the government wants to announce something serious, the speaker stands behind a podium with a seal, with a flag, with clean lighting, a suit, a rhythmic cadence. If a regular person said the same words on a subway platform in a hoodie, you'd ignore them. But the setting triggers submission because you've been conditioned to associate that sound, that rhythm, that look with credibility. That's why propaganda doesn't need to fabricate data. It just needs to deliver it through a body that feels official. Even typography matters. In one experiment, researchers gave participants a set of instructions in two fonts, one clean and professional, the other messy and irregular. The exact same text was rated more believable, more actionable, and more true when it was printed in the professional-looking font. The information didn't change. The belief did. Now apply this to state media, or political speeches, or marketing, or even social media influencers using studio-quality audio and high-definition video to give a trustworthy impression. None of it is about content. It's about effect, how it makes you feel before you even know what you think. Even silence is a tool. A slow pause before delivering a message, especially after a statement of concern, activates emotional receptivity. You've seen it 100 times. We understand your frustration. Pause. That's why we're taking action. It sounds responsible, thoughtful, serious, but it's choreography. And if it's done right, you don't notice it. You just agree. That's why authoritarian figures often speak in calm, measured tones. They don't shout. They don't need to. Because their entire delivery, from posture to intonation, is doing the work. They project inevitability, and most people confuse that with wisdom. Think of someone saying, "This is complicated. Let's look at the facts," versus, "Here's what's really happening." Which feels stronger? Which feels more certain? Which one are you more likely to repeat to someone else? That's the power of voice as a delivery system for belief. Because when someone sounds right, the brain fills in the rest. It doesn't matter if what they're saying is questionable. It sounds like it can't be questioned. Debate is theater. We grow up believing that debate is how truth is discovered. Two sides, each presenting facts, challenging each other, letting logic win. It's the foundation of democracy, journalism, academia, the noble art of civilized disagreement. But real debate almost never works that way, because most debate isn't about truth, it's about performance. Let's start with televised political debates. On the surface, they look rigorous. Candidates behind podiums, moderators with questions, time limits, fact-checkers. But the purpose isn't clarity. It's perception. Candidates aren't trying to persuade their opponent. They're trying to signal strength to the audience. Get the best soundbite. Appear confident. Land the memorable zinger that gets replayed. In 1980, Ronald Reagan leaned into the microphone and said, "There you go again," when Jimmy Carter brought up health policy. It didn't answer the question. It didn't refute anything, but it felt casual, dismissive, cool, and it stuck. That moment won more votes than any policy paper ever written. Because debate, in public, is a performance of certainty, not a search for truth. Now look at media debates. Cable news loves to stage them. Two talking heads, opposing views, split screen, raised voices. It creates the illusion of balance. One left, one right, one pro, one con. But the selection of guests is rarely neutral. The framing of questions isn't accidental. And most importantly, the format itself guarantees conflict, not understanding. You don't have time to explain nuance in 30 seconds. You don't get rewarded for listening. You win by interrupting, projecting confidence, and keeping your message emotionally sharp. The audience doesn't leave with insight. They leave with a side. And once the audience picks a side, they start defending it, not evaluating it. Debate becomes sport. Tribal, binary, your team, their team. If your side stumbles, it's the moderator's fault. If their side stumbles, it's proof they're wrong. The content of the argument stops mattering, only the score survives. Now take this to social media. Online debates aren't about ideas, they're about identity. Tweets aren't written to persuade, they're written to rally, to signal allegiance, to dunk on the enemy. Every thread, every quote, every subtweet, it's all structured around visibility, engagement, reinforcement, not reflection. And this is where propaganda thrives. Because propaganda doesn't need to win the argument, it just needs to create the illusion that an argument is happening and that one side is obviously correct. It relies on volume, repetition, audience applause, not thoughtful analysis. Even in universities, where debate should be most free, the format often determines the outcome. Framing a panel as free speech versus safety already implies that one side wants truth while the other wants censorship. Flip the title to Preventing Harm versus Extremism, and suddenly the sides feel reversed. The words chosen before the debate ever begins already start tipping the scales. That's the secret. He who frames the debate wins the debate before a single sentence is spoken. Because most people don't analyze positions. They absorb posture, tone, momentum, emotion. And once the theater starts, the actors stop being thinkers. They become avatars. And the audience doesn't leave with a better grasp of the issue. They leave cheering for the character they already agreed with. The 5 filters of the news. We like to imagine that the news is raw reality, things that happened, reported as they happened, by professionals committed to the truth. We know there's bias, sure, but we still assume that the basic structure of journalism is honest. If something's important, it gets covered. If it gets covered, it must be important. But what if the system isn't broken? What if it's working exactly as designed? In 1988, Edward Sess, Herman, and Noam Chomsky proposed a model called the propaganda model of media, not in dictatorships, but in free market democracies like the US. They identified 5 structural filters that determine what the public sees, not through censorship, through selection. Because the most effective propaganda doesn't lie. It filters. Let's break it down. Filter 1, ownership. Almost all major media outlets are owned by a small number of powerful corporations. CNN is owned by Warner Bros. Discovery. NBC is owned by Comcast. Fox News by Rupert Murdoch's empire. These companies don't just care about journalism, they care about profit, shareholders, and brand image. And you don't run stories that threaten your investors. Would a network owned by a weapons manufacturer run nightly exposés on military overreach? Would one owned by billionaires routinely challenge wealth inequality? The ownership isn't censorship, it's incentives alignment. Filter 2. Advertising. News doesn't make money from you. It makes money by selling your attention to advertisers, and advertisers don't want controversy. They want predictable audiences. If a story risks offending a demographic or a major sponsor, it's safer to kill it. This is why lifestyle content, celebrity news, and clickbait scandals get more airtime than labor strikes, drone warfare, or systemic poverty. The goal isn't to inform. The goal is to keep you watching. Filter 3, sourcing. Journalists don't witness everything firsthand. They rely on official sources, press releases, government spokespeople, corporate PR departments, and if they challenge those sources too aggressively, they risk losing access. This creates what Chomsky calls media dependency, where truth is gated by institutions. If the Pentagon says it happened, it gets printed. If a protester says it happened, it gets fact-checked. Objectivity becomes a loop between insiders. Filter 4, flack. When media steps out of line, they get flack. Lawsuits, advertiser threats, PR campaigns, angry viewers, smear pieces. Even the hint of reputational damage makes editors cautious. Self-censorship kicks in. Not from fear, from habit. Journalists start avoiding certain topics because they know what backlash looks like. It becomes routine, invisible, just part of the job, and the audience never knows what was left out. Filter 5, the common enemy. To unify a divided public, media needs a villain, a national threat, a moral panic. Sometimes it's communism, sometimes it's terrorism, sometimes it's immigrants, or fake news, or social decline. Whatever it is, it channels fear into loyalty and simplifies complex issues into us versus them. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a structure. Each filter shapes what you see, and more importantly, what you never realize you're not seeing. And the most disturbing part, most journalists aren't lying. They believe in what they're doing. They trust their sources. They chase the big stories. They think they're informing the public, but they're operating inside a machine that quietly decides which truths are useful and which truths can be ignored. Manufactured outrage. Some stories don't spread because they're important. They spread because they're infuriating. If you've ever felt yourself getting angrier, the more you scrolled, more offended, more betrayed, more morally certain, you weren't reacting to the truth. You were reacting to engineering. Because in today's media ecosystem, outrage is a product. It's not a glitch in the system. It is the system. Let's break this down. Outrage has always had emotional power. It creates identity. You feel bonded to others who share your anger. It creates clarity. No need to ask questions when you already know who's wrong. And most importantly, it creates action. You click, you share, you comment, you come back. But now, in the age of algorithmic media, outrage is no longer just a natural reaction. It's an intentional outcome. Social platforms like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok don't promote content that informs. They promote content that engages, and the fastest, cheapest form of engagement is emotional heat, especially moral heat. So the system evolves toward rage, not because there's a person behind the curtain pulling strings, but because outrage performs well, and what performs well gets replicated. News outlets adapt. Headlines grow sharper, stories get more one-sided, opposing views get flattened into caricatures, and subtlety, complexity, disappears. Suddenly, everything is a crisis. A celebrity says something insensitive. A corporation uses the wrong color in its logo. A viral video shows 10 seconds of conflict with no context. None of it has to be fake. It just has to be framed correctly. Clear villain, clear victim, strong emotion. The rest is noise. And once the audience is hooked, rage becomes ritual. You log on to feel disgusted. You seek confirmation that your side is righteous and theirs is sick. You watch someone get destroyed in a video clip. You comment with fire emojis, and for a moment, it feels good, controlled, certain. But nothing is learned. Nothing changes. It's not about truth. It's about catharsis. Take the term outrage bait. It describes content designed to trigger instant moral indignation. A man refuses to tip a waitress. A teacher disciplines a child. A protester screams at a stranger. No one asks about editing, context, prior events. Because outrage doesn't need context. It needs a hit of emotional certainty. And once that certainty arrives, thinking stops. Here's the deeper problem. When everything is outrageous, nothing is real. Injustice gets buried under fake controversies. Manufactured culture wars drown out structural harm, and the public burns out, not from apathy, but from constant stimulation. Moral fatigue sets in, and eventually outrage becomes background noise. That's the genius of the system. By feeding you outrage 24/7, it prevents you from knowing what to actually care about. You're too busy reacting to notice that your reactions are being guided. Outrage becomes a leash. You chase the story they've chosen. You bark when they want you to. You bite on command, not because you're stupid, but because anger feels like clarity. And propaganda always prefers emotion over doubt. Villains need costumes. Every good story needs a villain. Not just someone who disagrees, someone who threatens everything, someone dangerous, corrupt, inhuman. And most importantly, someone recognizable. That's why propaganda always gives its enemies a costume. A symbol, a look, a phrase, a soundbite, something that instantly signals, this is the bad guy. The goal isn't truth, it's cognitive efficiency. Your brain doesn't have time to analyze every moral question from scratch. It relies on shortcuts, and visual shortcuts are the fastest. That's where the costume comes in. In World War II, Allied propaganda portrayed Nazis as robotic, cold, militaristic, jackboots, black uniforms, red banners. Meanwhile, Axis propaganda painted Allied leaders as grotesque, greedy, weak. Both sides simplified real people into characters. Not because it was accurate, because it was useful. Because once the villain has a costume, the audience doesn't ask questions. They cheer when he gets punched. Modern propaganda is no different, just more subtle. Think about how protesters are shown depending on political alignment. On one channel, they're brave defenders of justice. On another, they're violent radicals. The footage might be identical. A street, a chant, a raised fist. But the framing changes the costume. Are they freedom fighters or terrorists? Are they concerned parents or conspiracy mobs? The same group can wear two different costumes depending on who's holding the camera. This is how dehumanization works. First you reduce someone to a symbol, then you strip away complexity, then you assign traits, evil, irrational, subversive, dangerous, and finally, you make them predictable. Because once someone is wearing the villain costume, everything they do is automatically interpreted as bad, even when they're not doing anything. Propaganda thrives on this. Look at how certain ideologies are portrayed in media. A young man with a beard and backpack becomes suspicious. A woman wearing a headscarf becomes oppressed. A black teenager with a hoodie becomes threatening. A homeless person on a bench becomes lazy. None of these are facts, they're costumes. Visual cues that trigger moral judgment before thought begins. And the most disturbing part, once we've seen the costume enough times, we start seeing it everywhere. Pattern recognition takes over. Even if the actual person doesn't match the stereotype, the association is already in place. The moment we feel danger or disgust, our mind fills in the details. We don't need evidence. We already know. This is how entire populations are turned against minorities, how fear becomes policy, how violence becomes justification. All you need is the right costume and a story to go with it. In Rwanda, before the 1994 genocide, radio broadcasts repeatedly called Tutsis cockroaches. They weren't described as people, they were reduced to a symbol, a pest, and when the violence began, the killers didn't feel like murderers. They felt like exterminators. That's how far this can go. But in most cases, it doesn't take genocide. Just distraction, simplification, moral certainty, a cartoon version of the enemy, broadcast enough times until it becomes impossible to see the real person underneath. Because when someone's wearing the costume, you stop listening. You start reacting, and that's all propaganda needs. News cycles create amnesia. You remember the outrage, the headline, the flood of takes, the moment when it felt like everything was about to change, and then nothing. A new headline, a new story, a new moment. The old one fades, not because it was resolved, not because the truth came out, but because the news moved on, and you did too. That's not just distraction. It's not information overload. It's amnesia by design. In the modern news cycle, the most powerful stories don't get buried, they get replaced. Let's take an example. In 2018, a journalist named Jamal Khashoggi, a U.S. resident, was murdered and dismembered inside a Saudi consulate. It was global news. Clear evidence, political fallout. There was a week where it felt like the world had changed. But within a month, the story had vanished. Buried under celebrity scandals, election noise, sports victories. No trial, no justice, no systemic accountability. But more importantly, no memory. That's the danger of a system built on constant novelty. If today's event doesn't become today's identity, it disappears. The memory doesn't stick. It gets pushed down the timeline, scrolled past, overwritten by newer emotion. Psychologists call this the recency bias, our tendency to weigh recent information more heavily than older, possibly more important events. And media structures now exploit it constantly, not just to shape what we care about, but to ensure we forget what we cared about last week. It's not just about stories, it's about scale. When every story is breaking, when every headline demands urgency, the mind becomes numb. It can't hold on to everything. So it triages. And what survives? The stories that fit your emotional pattern, that reinforce what you already believe, that make you feel smart or angry or righteous. Everything else fades. Even facts get rewritten this way. Think about how long the U.S. stayed in Afghanistan. 2 decades, thousands of lives, trillions of dollars. But when the withdrawal happened, most coverage focused on the chaos of the exit, not the 20 years leading to it, not the contractors, not the secret deals. The memory was compressed into a single moment, a single emotional spike. Then it disappeared. This is what Chomsky called the doctrine of immediacy, the idea that only what's happening now matters, and anything not reinforced through repetition will vanish, not by suppression, but by inattention. It's a kind of narrative erosion, one that leaves no historical sediment behind. And here's where it becomes propaganda. Because if a system can flood your attention with small crises, moral dramas, viral clips, trending conflicts, it can keep you emotionally activated while making sure you never build a coherent picture. You know everything, but you understand nothing. And when people don't understand, they stop asking questions. They wait for the next story, the next symbol, the next hit. That's how you erase the past without ever touching it. You don't burn records. You bury them under noise. Controlled opposition. If you want to neutralize dissent, you don't always have to silence it. You can just control it. Let it scream. Let it protest. Let it publish angry manifestos. As long as it's doing it inside the box you've built, you control the opposition, and it doesn't even know. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a known strategy. Governments have used it. Corporations use it. Algorithms use it. It works because people confuse permission with power. The principle is simple. If you can't prevent people from being angry, make sure they get angry at the right things, in the right way, in a place where nothing changes. Let's go back to the Cold War. In East Germany, the Stasi ran one of the most effective surveillance states in history. But they didn't just monitor enemies. They infiltrated activist groups. Some agents posed as passionate radicals, even leading protests, while quietly keeping things disorganized, ineffective, or off-message. The result? People felt like they were resisting, but their resistance was being steered. This wasn't censorship, it was containment. Today, the same mechanism is more subtle, but more widespread. Take social media. Outrage is everywhere, but what's missing is action. You see a scandal, a moral disaster, a viral clip that demands justice. People comment, share, argue. A hashtag trends. And then, nothing. No policy changes. No material consequence. The rage was real. But it happened inside a sandbox built to absorb it, not direct it. That's digital controlled opposition. The illusion of dissent in a space where it can't threaten anything. Even worse, some platforms elevate certain voices precisely because they're loud, controversial, and doomed to fail. They attract attention, dominate conversation, and then implode, either through scandal, infighting, or irrelevance. But in the meantime, they serve a function. They drain energy from more strategic movements. Sometimes this is algorithmic, sometimes it's structural, sometimes it's intentional. But the result is the same. The people who think they're resisting are often stuck performing resistance inside arenas, designed to go nowhere. Here's a more chilling example. In the US during the 1960s and 70s, the FBI ran a program called COINTELPRO. Its goal, disrupt and discredit domestic political movements, especially civil rights groups. They didn't just surveil activists, they sent anonymous letters to sow distrust. They promoted infighting. They amplified leaders who were easy to discredit, all under the guise of letting dissent flourish. The surface looked like chaos. The reality was orchestration. Why does this work so well? Because people want to believe they're speaking truth to power. They want to believe their protests matter, their anger counts. So they follow the loudest voices, the flashiest debates, the emotional spectacles, not realizing that their resistance has been predicted, pre-categorized, and preemptively absorbed. Controlled opposition isn't about censorship, it's about giving the fire a place to burn where nothing ever catches. The fiction of objectivity. We like to believe that facts are facts, that truth floats above opinion. That somewhere, buried beneath the noise, there's a neutral ground where reality just is what it is. And we want journalists, scientists, and educators to stand on that ground, to report the world objectively. But objectivity, as it's sold to the public, is a fiction. Because what we call objectivity is almost always just a carefully managed point of view, framed, selected, packaged to appear impartial, while quietly reinforcing a deeper structure of power. Let's start with the basics. No one can report everything. There are always choices: what to include, what to omit, what order to present it in, which sources to trust, which words to use. Each choice shapes the frame, and the frame shapes the truth. If a protest happens and a news outlet describes it as chaotic, that's a frame. If they call it spirited, that's a different one. If they say violent, public opinion shifts. The footage might be the same. The facts might be identical, but the language controls interpretation. And it's not just adjectives, it's structure. A balanced news story might give equal time to a climate scientist and a paid oil lobbyist, as if both sides are equally credible. That's not objectivity. That's false equivalence. But it feels neutral. It feels fair, because fairness in media often just means treating all sides as if they were equal, even when they're not. That's the trap. Objectivity doesn't mean true. It means professionally detached, polished, emotionally flat, and that tone, that deliberate coolness, is used to make a claim sound more credible, even when the substance is shaky. We see this in headlines like, "Some experts say voting machines could be vulnerable. Critics claim policy may harm families." There's no lie, but there's also no clarity. Just a performance of neutrality. A fog of qualified language that lets the outlet off the hook, while letting the message slip through anyway. This is what philosopher Pierre Bourdieu called symbolic violence, the power to impose meaning without appearing to do so, the power to shape reality while pretending to simply observe it. And it's everywhere. In science, objectivity is often confused with statistical detachment, even when funding sources, institutional bias, and methodological framing clearly tilt the field. In education, textbooks claim neutrality, while quietly promoting state-approved narratives of history, morality, and identity. In tech, platforms insist they're neutral tools, even as their algorithms decide which stories spread and which voices disappear. And in journalism, objectivity is used as a shield. Reporters say, "We're just presenting both sides." But that phrase is often a signal, not of truth-seeking, but of narrative laundering. It means the outlet doesn't want to take responsibility for what it's implying. But objectivity isn't wrong because bias is better. It's wrong because pretending not to have a perspective is itself a perspective. One that can be weaponized, one that can hide in plain sight. And when objectivity is used to avoid moral judgment, to flatten human suffering into disputes and oppression into complexity, it becomes a mask for cowardice. The real question isn't whether someone is objective, it's who their neutrality protects. Schools were modeled after factories. Imagine waking up, walking into a building at 8 a.m., lining up in silence, sitting in a row, and waiting for a bell to tell you when to speak, when to move, when to stop thinking and start absorbing. That's not a prison. That's school. But it wasn't always like this. Because the school system, as most people know it today, wasn't designed to nurture curiosity, creativity, or critical thought. It was designed to produce obedience, punctuality, and predictable output. The modern classroom wasn't built like a library or a laboratory. It was built like a factory floor. And that was on purpose. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during the rise of industrial capitalism, powerful nations needed something new, a labor force that could read instructions, follow schedules, and tolerate boredom without rebellion. Mass education wasn't just about enlightenment, it was about efficiency. Factory work required factory minds. Enter the Prussian model of education, the blueprint for much of modern schooling. It emphasized centralized control, standardized curricula, age-based grades, compulsory attendance, and, most importantly, hierarchical authority. The teacher was the supervisor. The students were the raw material. Bells marked the shift. Tests measured the output. And the goal wasn't to produce philosophers, it was to produce citizens. Obedient, reliable, easily sorted, able to sit still, able to memorize, able to perform the same task every day, without asking why. This wasn't a secret. In 1905, Elwood Cubberley, one of the architects of the American school system, openly stated that schools should be factories in which the raw products, children, are shaped and fashioned. Not inspired. Shaped. Even the classroom layout reflects this. Rows of desks facing forward. One voice in control. The silence of the factory floor. Independent thought is possible, but it's not the default. The structure trains you to wait for permission, to raise your hand before speaking, to write down the right answer, not challenge the question. It trains compliance, and that compliance extends far beyond the classroom. Because the habits school installs, punctuality, deference to authority, standardized thinking, are carried into adult life, into workplaces, bureaucracies, voting booths. If you follow the rules, you succeed. If you ask too many questions, you're disruptive. And when rebellion happens, it's usually pre-scripted, spirit week, debate club, student council, all of it carefully contained. Safe rebellion. Performative freedom. But here's the twist. Most teachers don't see it this way. They believe they're helping. And many are in small, meaningful ways. But they're trapped in a system that doesn't reward intellectual danger. It rewards control. Output, order, funding depends on test scores. Behavior is managed like risk. The most successful schools are often the most disciplined, not the most thoughtful. This is what makes institutional propaganda so effective. It doesn't need to lie, it just needs to structure your environment, your hours, your posture, your expectations, until the system becomes invisible. And once you've spent 12 years being conditioned to sit still, follow rules, absorb approved content, and ask permission before being human, you don't need to be told how to behave anymore. You'll do it yourself. The hidden curriculum. You probably think school is about learning facts. Math, grammar, history, science, subjects, units, tests. That's what shows up on the report card. That's what students get graded on. That's the curriculum. But beneath the official lessons, there's a second curriculum, unspoken, unofficial, and far more powerful. It teaches you how to behave, who you are, what to value, what to fear, what to expect from life. This is what sociologists call the hidden curriculum, the emotional and behavioral lessons that are baked into the structure of education itself. Not what school teaches on paper, what school teaches by experience. Let's look at some examples. In most classrooms, the teacher talks. The students listen. The teacher decides when you may speak, when you may move, what counts as success and what counts as a mistake. The student's job is to obey, not because the teacher is cruel, but because the system is designed around hierarchy. And hierarchy teaches submission. You may learn about democracy in civics class, but you don't live it. You live in an environment where decisions are top-down, authority is unquestionable, and compliance is rewarded. Now look at grading. You might think grades are objective. They're not. They're instruments of classification. If you follow directions, memorize well, and reproduce answers, you're rewarded. If you question the process, challenge the material, or learn in a non-linear way, you're punished. Not always with malice, just with lower scores. You learn quickly. Obedience gets points. Dissent gets detention. The content barely matters. And that's the first part of the hidden curriculum. Conformity. Now let's talk about time. School breaks your day into rigid hourly units. Bells tell you when to start, when to stop. You can't follow your curiosity past the allotted 45 minutes. You can't finish a conversation, the bell decides. You can't leave the room without permission. Over time, this builds a habit. You internalize external control. You stop asking what you want to do. You start asking what you're allowed to do. Then there's competition. Grades are ranked. Awards are given. Honor rolls, class rankings, gifted tracks all create a pyramid. Students are sorted, labeled, and compared constantly. Even friendships are shaped by proximity and grouping. Advanced kids here, remedial kids there. This isn't just tracking. It's social programming. You learn where you belong, what you're worth, whether you're a leader or a follower, whether your voice matters or doesn't. And over time, these signals become self-fulfilling. A student labeled average learns not to expect more. A student labeled difficult learns to resist. A student labeled gifted learns to fear failure. All of them learn to see themselves as systems see them. That's the hidden curriculum. It's not written in any textbook, but it's what students remember most. They may forget how to factor polynomials, but they'll remember the humiliation of being called slow. They'll remember the thrill of getting an A. They'll remember who was allowed to speak and who wasn't. And that's why the hidden curriculum is more powerful than the official one, because it doesn't just teach information, it teaches identity. The morality of the nation. Every country teaches values, but the values it teaches aren't universal. They're not neutral. They're not even consistent. They're custom-fitted to serve the story that power wants to tell, the version of history, duty, and identity that keeps the structure stable. And the first time you hear that story is usually in school. Not in politics class, in kindergarten, in coloring books, in songs, in national holidays, in textbooks that present wars as necessary, victories as righteous, and borders as natural. From the very beginning, you're not just learning information, you're being trained in moral orientation. Let's take a closer look. In most countries, children are taught to feel pride in their nation's founding. The leaders are portrayed as noble. The revolution, if there was one, was just. The Constitution or equivalent document is sacred. The flag is not just a symbol, but something you may be required to pledge to. And this is often presented as moral education. You're not just being taught that George Washington existed, you're being taught that George Washington was a hero, that his struggle was righteous, that independence, loyalty, and sacrifice are the highest virtues when they serve the nation. That's the core lesson. Morality is patriotic. Now imagine what happens when a child asks why the same government also committed genocide against indigenous people, or enslaved others, or invaded foreign nations. If those events are mentioned at all, they're softened, framed, turned into footnotes. Unfortunately, in those days, a complex chapter, the moral logic flips. Instead of moral clarity, you get moral fog. Instead of horror, you get regret. The message becomes, the past had problems, but the present is still good. The system works, the story holds. This is moral indoctrination, not by what it says, by what it protects. You're not just taught what's right and wrong, you're taught who gets to define those terms. And in most school systems, the nation defines them. The state doesn't just govern your body, it curates your conscience. Even holidays reinforce this. Veterans Day, Independence Day, Founders Day, National Heroes Day. Each one is a ritual reminder, this country is good. Sacrifice for it is sacred. Fine dissent should be careful. And when the nation does something wrong in the present, say mass surveillance, police violence, unjust war, many people struggle to feel outrage. Not because they lack empathy, but because their moral reflexes were wired to trust the state. That wiring doesn't come from debate, it comes from repetition. Now think about the global implications. In the US, students learn that dropping atomic bombs ended World War II and saved lives. In Japan, students are taught about Hiroshima and Nagasaki as human tragedies. Both accounts are technically true, but the moral lesson is different. Because the narrator is different, and the state always writes the script in its own favor. This isn't education, it's narrative moral engineering. And it works, because by the time you reach adulthood, the country you live in doesn't feel like one possible arrangement of power. It feels like a moral identity, which means questioning it doesn't just feel rebellious, it feels wrong. Obedience disguised as respect. You were probably told to respect your elders, respect your teachers, respect your leaders, respect the law, respect authority. But no one ever explained what respect meant. Because in practice, what they usually meant was, don't argue, don't disobey, don't question. That's not respect. That's obedience, dressed in moral language. And it starts early. In school, respect is often defined by tone and posture. You speak when called on. You don't raise your voice. You don't challenge the teacher, even if you're right, even if the rule is wrong, even if the treatment is unfair. Respect means accepting the hierarchy, regardless of justice. The deeper message, power is moral, submission is virtue, and once that equation is in place, it follows you into adult life. You're expected to respect your boss, your priest, your officer, your president, not based on wisdom or compassion, but based on position. The title is enough. The uniform is enough. The badge is enough. If you resist, you're disrespectful. If you question, you're rude. If you disobey, you're a problem. This is how institutions install obedience without admitting it. Because obedience sounds authoritarian, but respect sounds noble, polite, responsible. You're not being controlled, you're just being civil. It's a clever trick, and it works. Because when obedience is framed as respect, disobedience becomes immoral. And once you associate morality with submission, authority no longer has to prove itself. It only has to demand respect. Let's look at policing. In many societies, police are trained to see non-compliance as disrespect. If you ask, why am I being stopped, or what are my rights, that can escalate the situation. Not because you've broken the law, but because you've challenged the emotional authority of the officer. You failed to perform the expected submission, and so the interaction turns violent, not legally, but psychologically. The charge isn't resistance, it's disrespect. Now take this to the family. In many households, children are taught to respect their parents, which often means never talking back, never disagreeing, never asserting boundaries. Even in abusive homes, children are told to honor the abuser, to stay silent, to be respectful, because tradition says so, because they're your parent. Again, the word doesn't mean what it claims. It means obey, even when it hurts. This distortion shows up in culture too. In militaries, soldiers are trained to salute, not because the person being saluted has earned it, but because the ritual itself enforces the structure. Rank creates deference. Even if the officer is incompetent, even if they're wrong, the gesture keeps the illusion intact. And in politics, this gets especially dangerous. People say respect the office, even if the person in it is corrupt, abusive, or openly harmful. The institution becomes sacred, immune to judgment, immune to failure. Why? Because you've been trained since childhood to confuse obedience with virtue and to call that confusion respect. But real respect isn't about power. It's about listening, integrity, mutual recognition, the willingness to be challenged and still hold your ground. That kind of respect is earned. What most institutions demand isn't that. They demand obedience with a smile. The rituals of school. If you step back and watch a typical school day from a distance without knowing what's being taught, what do you see? Lines of children moving on cue, bells signaling when to stop and when to go, pledges recited in unison, standing, sitting, silence, permission slips, hand raises, rewards for rule following, punishments for disobedience, all repeated every day for years. That's not education. That's ritual, and it's doing more than keeping order. It's installing a worldview, not through lessons, but through behavioral rehearsal, not through what's said, but through what's done, again and again, until it becomes invisible. This is how ideology is implanted without words. In many schools, children begin each day standing, facing a flag, placing their hand over their heart, and reciting a script. The words are rarely questioned. They're memorized before they're understood. One nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. This isn't just a declaration, it's a loyalty oath, and it's being performed by 6-year-olds. Imagine a society where children stood each morning to pledge loyalty to critical thinking, or to human rights, or to compassion. It would feel strange, political, even manipulative. But pledging loyalty to a flag, to the nation, that feels normal, because it's been ritualized. And that's the point. Rituals make ideology feel natural, not because they're logical, but because they bypass logic entirely. You don't think about rituals, you enact them. Your body learns before your mind does, and that's what makes them powerful. Now look at bells. In most schools, bells dictate the rhythm of the day. When to begin, when to end, when to eat, when to stop learning. The bell isn't just a sound, it's a command. It divides your life into artificial units, detaching content from context, cutting curiosity into chunks. You don't follow your attention. You follow the tone. Over time, you internalize that rhythm. You start to anticipate the cue. You begin to associate learning with compartmentalized time, as if knowledge comes in 45-minute portions, followed by a different subject, followed by lunch. This isn't education, it's training. Then there's the ritual of hand-raising. Before you speak, you must be chosen. Before you move, you must ask. Even asking to go to the bathroom is mediated by authority. Your body becomes part of the structure, regulated, policed, disciplined, not for safety, for order. Because once your body learns submission, your mind tends to follow. Now consider dress codes. Uniforms, hair rules, no hats, no slogans, no individuality that threatens coherence. The message is subtle but clear. Who you are matters less than how you conform. Expression is tolerated within limits, but deviance is punished quickly. You learn what's appropriate, not just in fashion, in behavior, in thought. And finally, graduation. A cap, a robe, a slow walk, a handshake, a diploma. It mimics religious ceremony. It says, you've completed the journey. You've followed the rules. You've earned entry into the next stage of the system. It's not just an accomplishment, it's a ritual reward. It teaches this: if you conform long enough, you'll be rewarded with symbolic recognition. The rituals of school aren't side effects, they're the delivery system for institutional ideology. You're not just learning subjects, you're learning where you stand. History books are edited by winners. History is supposed to be the story of what happened. But what gets taught as history, especially in schools, is rarely a neutral record. It's a curated story, a political tool, a moral map written after the fact, not to explain the past, but to justify the present. Because history books are not written by the victims. They're written by the victors. And the purpose of official history isn't clarity. It's continuity, the illusion that the current system is the natural outcome of progress, justice, and wisdom. Let's start with something simple. Who gets included? In most national textbooks, the central figures are the founders, the generals, the presidents, the empire builders. Their flaws are softened, their crimes are contextualized, their victories are celebrated. Names like Columbus, Napoleon, Lincoln, and Churchill are enshrined, and the people they conquered, often footnotes. For centuries, history was told through great men, not systems, not masses, not suffering. We learn about the American Revolution, but not the extermination of native tribes that followed. We learn about the Civil War, but rarely about how slavery was rebranded into Jim Crow. We learn about World War II, but not the firebombing of Tokyo or the colonial massacres that funded the Allies before the war even began. The structure is always the same. We were the good guys, even when we weren't. Now look at how events are framed. Words like settlement, exploration, and expansion are used to describe acts of theft, invasion, and genocide. Europeans didn't invade the Americas, they discovered them. Slavery wasn't torture, it was economic dependence. Colonialism wasn't theft, it was civilizing the savages. The language is cleaned, sanitized, made safe for children. But that's not education, that's narrative laundering. And it's intentional. Because if the real story were told, with all its horror, all its contradiction, all its unresolved blood, students might start asking questions the system isn't designed to answer. Questions like, who built this? Who was erased? Who decided this was the story? Even the timeline is selective. In the US, school history often starts with 1776. But what about 1619? Or 1492? Or 10,000 years of indigenous civilizations before any Europeans arrived? The further back you look, the more obvious it becomes. History isn't what happened, it's what survived. What was written down, what was repeated, what was chosen, and what was discarded. In Japan, textbooks still downplay the Nanking Massacre, one of the worst atrocities of World War II. In Turkey, the Armenian genocide is barely mentioned. In China, the Tiananmen Square massacre is scrubbed from official memory. In the US, textbooks once described enslaved people as happy workers. These weren't fringe opinions, they were institutional doctrine. And even when corrections are made, the system resists. When educators try to include slavery, segregation, or genocide in fuller detail, they're accused of being divisive, unpatriotic, or anti-history. Because the real problem isn't truth. The real problem is what truth might disrupt. Because if students see the cracks in the narrative, they might start wondering whether the system they're part of was built to serve everyone, or just those who got to write the ending. History, as told by institutions, isn't designed to liberate, it's designed to keep the winners on top. Discipline is belief enforcement. In school, discipline is supposed to teach responsibility. Follow the rules. Be on time. Don't cheat. Don't talk back. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like preparation for adulthood. But look closer. Discipline doesn't just punish behavior, it reinforces belief. It teaches you how to believe, what to believe, and who is allowed to challenge belief, and who isn't. And it does this without ever needing to say the word belief. Start with the basics. In most schools, students are punished more for how they behave than for what they do. A wrong answer might lose you a point, but the tone you use when asking a question, that can land you in detention. You're not just being measured for correctness, you're being trained for compliance. Because the real lesson is this: even if you're right, if you challenge authority the wrong way, you're wrong. This is belief enforcement. You're being taught that truth doesn't matter if it disrupts the structure. Now look at how discipline is applied. In most schools, discipline disproportionately targets certain students: the poor, the neurodivergent, the racially marginalized. It's not always conscious, it's not always malicious. But the result is consistent. The further you are from the ideal student, the more your behavior is framed as deviant. You're not curious, you're disruptive. You're not passionate, you're aggressive. You're not confused, you're disrespectful. These aren't observations, they're judgments. And those judgments are shaped by who the institution expects to obey. Which means discipline isn't just a response to behavior, it's a filter for belief acceptability. And once you're labeled, it sticks. Students learn this fast. Speak too often, and you're annoying. Speak too little, and you're disengaged. Challenge a teacher, and you're defiant. Stay quiet during injustice, and you're well-behaved. Eventually you learn the real rules, not the ones printed on posters, the ones enforced through looks, grades, referrals, and isolation. And those rules say, don't question the curriculum. Don't interrupt authority. Don't trust your instincts over the handbook. This is how belief is shaped, not by lectures, by discipline. Because once punishment becomes the cost of dissent, belief becomes safer than thought. Now, take this outside school. In workplaces, questioning a manager gets labeled as insubordination. In politics, whistleblowers get prosecuted. In police interactions, asking about your rights can escalate the situation. In all of these, the same logic applies. Power isn't challenged by truth, it's challenged by disobedience, and disobedience must be punished to preserve belief. The philosopher Michel Foucault wrote extensively on this. In Discipline and Punish, he argued that modern institutions don't need to torture the body to control it. They just need to organize it, measure it, observe it, correct it, isolate it, until the body trains the mind. Discipline becomes self-discipline. The rules become internal, and when that happens, no one has to tell you what to believe anymore. You already feel it. Religious indoctrination as default. In most parts of the world, children are taught religion before they're taught to think, before critical thinking, before history, before logic. Religion arrives first, as fact. Not as one worldview among many, not as a human tradition with philosophical depth, but as reality itself. At the dinner table, in morning prayers, through school rituals, on state holidays, belief is everywhere. And because it's everywhere, it doesn't feel like belief. It feels like the way the world works. By the time a child is old enough to ask questions, they've already learned what happens to people who do. That's what makes religious indoctrination different from belief. Belief can be chosen. Indoctrination happens before choice is even possible. Let's look at how this plays out. In many U.S. states, public school classrooms still begin the day with students standing, placing their hands over their hearts, and pledging allegiance to one nation under God. It's recited mechanically like the alphabet, long before most children know what a nation is, what a God is, or what allegiance means. It's not just symbolic, it's conditioning. In Saudi Arabia, Quranic recitation is part of the daily curriculum from the earliest grades. Children memorize verses before they know how to analyze a sentence. In India, Hindu prayers are often part of the morning assembly in public schools. In Israel, religious and secular education are split, creating two moral worlds from the age of 5. None of this is presented as ideology. It's presented as tradition, as identity, as heritage. But what it really teaches is certainty. Not moral reasoning, not humility, not exploration, just certainty about who you are, who God is, what's right, what's wrong, and what happens if you break the rules. And because this certainty is passed down by authority figures, parents, teachers, institutions, it feels safe, safe to obey, dangerous to question. That's the point. If religion were introduced at age 20, after philosophy, ethics, science, literature, it might look different. It might be respected as one framework among many, but introduced at age 4, it becomes a lens you can't see around. And for many, leaving it is unthinkable. Because religion doesn't just explain the universe, it becomes your social life, your holidays, your family rituals, your sense of goodness, your emotional vocabulary. Walking away isn't just a philosophical shift, it's a kind of death. Even worse, many children are taught that doubt itself is a sin, that asking the wrong question is a spiritual failure, that hell, or shame, or exile is the price of thinking too hard. So the questions are buried, and belief becomes a reflex. That's why indoctrination is so effective, because it doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't prove, it arrives first. National myths replace truth. Every country has a story it tells about itself. But that story isn't history. It's myth, a selective narrative designed not to explain the past, but to justify the present. You learn it young. Through flags, through anthems, through holidays, and textbooks and school plays. You hear about noble founders, brave soldiers, righteous wars, Moral progress. The message is clear. This place is good. It may not be perfect, but it stands for something. It means something. And the truth gets buried under that meaning. Take the United States. You're taught that the nation was founded on liberty, that the revolution was fought for freedom, that the Constitution is sacred. But you rarely hear that the men who wrote it owned slaves. That freedom didn't include women, indigenous people, or the enslaved. That genocide and forced labor were built into the system from the beginning. Those aren't just historical footnotes, they're structural truths, but national myths smooth them over. George Washington becomes the father of democracy, not the general who ordered the mass killing of indigenous resistors. Lincoln is the great emancipator, not the man who only supported abolition when it became strategically useful. America becomes a beacon of liberty, even while funding dictatorships and toppling elected governments abroad. The myth needs heroes, and so history is edited to provide them. This isn't unique to the U.S. In Japan, students often learn more about rebuilding after World War II than about the atrocities committed during it. In Turkey, the Armenian genocide is still not officially acknowledged in school curricula. In Britain, empire is remembered as civilizing, not as centuries of resource theft, racial hierarchy, and mass repression. Even the language is strategic. Words like exploration, discovery, and civilization are used to describe colonization, rebellion, instead of revolution, unrest instead of oppression, war on terror, instead of invasion. These aren't neutral terms, they're moral filters. Each one tells you how to feel before you've had the chance to think. That's the role of national myth, to make the current system feel inevitable, to frame the winners as virtuous, to train people not just in patriotism, but in emotional loyalty to a version of the past that never really happened. And that loyalty comes with rules. If you challenge the myth, if you bring up massacres, coups, systemic discrimination, you're labeled ungrateful, unpatriotic, divisive. Not because what you're saying is false, but because it disrupts the emotional script that people were raised to believe in. A nation's myth isn't there to teach you history, it's there to make you stop asking questions. Education or indoctrination. What's the difference between education and indoctrination? Most people think it's about content. That education teaches you how to think, while indoctrination tells you what to think. That education opens the mind, and indoctrination closes it, but the real difference isn't what's taught. It's whether you're allowed to question it. In most school systems, you're not. You can question a math problem. You can ask about grammar rules. But when it comes to patriotism, religion, history, obedience, and authority, the big ideas, the lesson is already written. The structure already answers for you. And if you push too hard, you're disruptive, disrespectful, a problem. The institution doesn't correct you with reason. It corrects you with silence, grades, isolation, or punishment. That's not education. That's conditioning. And like all good conditioning, it happens invisibly. From the first day of school, you're trained in posture, schedule, hierarchy. You memorize national myths. You celebrate state-approved heroes. You take standardized tests that reward repetition, not thought. You raise your hand to speak. You request permission to leave the room. The structure teaches as much as the subject, and that structure is designed to produce predictability, not curiosity. This doesn't mean your teachers are lying to you. Most of them believe in what they're doing. Many genuinely want you to think, but they're trapped inside a system that doesn't reward open-ended inquiry. It rewards control, performance, obedience masked as order. The curriculum says one thing. The hidden curriculum says something else. And here's how you can tell. If a system punishes doubt, it's not education. Real education teaches you how to doubt safely. It gives you tools to explore other worldviews. It introduces you to dangerous ideas, not to convert you, but to show you that belief can be examined. It makes room for disagreement. Indoctrination doesn't. It isolates you from alternatives. It punishes questions it can't easily answer. It fills silence with certainty. It ties truth to authority and morality to compliance, and it leaves you with a simple reflex. If I want to succeed, I better stop asking so many questions. This is how ideology survives, not through censorship, through ritual, routine, and repetition, through systems that feel like education, but operate like enforcement. And by the time you graduate, the real lesson has already landed. Trust the system. Don't look too closely. Don't pull the wrong thread. Just pass the test. The family as first ideological unit. Long before school, before media, before church, before the state, your first exposure to ideology was your family. And you didn't just learn language, manners, and how to tie your shoes. You learned how the world works, who to trust, what's normal, what's dangerous, what kinds of people are good, and which ones aren't. The family doesn't feel like an institution. It feels natural, intimate, human. But that's what makes it powerful. It doesn't preach ideology. It lives it. And you, as a child, absorb it through repetition, tone, silence, emotion, reward, punishment. No lectures required. Think about how children learn gender. It starts with toys, colors, expectations. Boys get trucks and are told to be tough. Girls get dolls and are praised for being sweet. Deviating from this gets corrected, subtly or aggressively. Parents don't have to explain patriarchy. They perform it, and the child internalizes it long before they understand what it is. The same goes for class. How money is spoken about or not spoken about teaches a child where they fit in the world. Some families teach ambition, others teach fear, some teach entitlement, others teach resentment. And these lessons come through dinner table conversations, reactions to news, judgments of neighbors, casual comments in the car. By age 5, most children have already formed political instincts. Not because they understand politics, because they understand what makes their parents angry. And anger is a lesson. So is silence. When a child asks why someone is poor, or why two men are holding hands, or why their skin is different, and the parent changes the subject or answers with disgust, the child learns what should not be talked about, what should be hidden, what must be judged. And this happens in every kind of family: liberal, conservative, religious, secular, rich, poor. The specifics change, but the mechanism stays the same. Because the family is the first narrative machine. It hands down myths, stories about heritage, morality, danger, love, identity. You don't question the story, because the storytellers are the people you trust most. The ones who feed you, comfort you, keep you alive. And so their worldview becomes your emotional foundation. Even when you grow up and reject it, the structure remains. It becomes the default you compare everything else against. The voice in your head that still flinches when you disagree too loudly. That's why governments focus so heavily on the family. Politicians talk about family values not because they care about intimacy, but because they know this is where belief gets built. This is where power becomes invisible. This is where ideology becomes love. And it's hard to argue with love. Gaslighting is propaganda. Gaslighting is usually talked about in the context of personal abuse, a manipulative partner, a toxic parent, a controlling boss. But when the same tactics are used at scale by institutions, media, or governments, it stops being personal. It becomes propaganda. At its core, gaslighting is about control through disorientation. It's not just about lying. It's about making the target doubt their own mind, their memory, their emotions, their perception of reality. And when a state or system starts doing that to millions of people at once, it creates a public that can be manipulated not through fear but through self-doubt. Let's make this concrete. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread globally, many governments downplayed the threat in its early stages. Some denied it was airborne. Some told citizens masks didn't help, only to reverse course later. When people questioned this, they were accused of panic. Then when the narrative shifted, the same institutions pretended those original claims had never been made. No admission, no reckoning, just a slow erasure of memory and a quiet expectation that the public would forget. That's institutional gaslighting. It's not about admitting error, it's about rewriting the timeline and punishing you for remembering it differently. Authoritarian regimes have used this tactic for decades. In the Soviet Union, newspapers would revise past headlines without acknowledgement. People who had been publicly praised would suddenly be labeled enemies, and if you remembered otherwise, you were the one at fault. In George Orwell's 1984, the Ministry of Truth literally rewrites the past to match the present. That's not just fiction. It's a psychological strategy. If reality can change at any moment, and the authorities are always right, then truth becomes whatever they say it is. And that's the end goal of gaslighting is propaganda. Not to convince you of a specific lie, but to weaken your confidence in the idea of truth itself. Once you stop trusting your own memory, your own judgment, your own perception, you become dependent. You need someone else to tell you what's real. You cling to the loudest voice, the strongest hand, the most consistent authority, not because you believe them, but because you've been trained to doubt yourself. Even democracies use this. Political parties routinely deny they ever said things that were filmed, tweeted, or published. When shown proof, they dismiss it as taken out of context or fake news. When people protest injustice, media outlets frame it as hysteria. You're imagining it. It's not that bad. This is normal. Over time, this erodes not just trust, but sanity. You start second-guessing your reactions. You hesitate to speak up. You assume you might be the problem. And that hesitation, that's the goal. Because if people stop believing their own eyes, their own minds, their own sense of justice, they don't need to be silenced. They'll silence themselves. False choice framing. Do you want the red team or the blue team, Coke or Pepsi? Are you pro-security or pro-chaos? These questions sound like choices, but they're not. They're traps. Because what matters isn't which option you pick. What matters is who gave you the options. This is false choice framing, one of the most common and invisible tools of thought control. You're given two sides, two teams, two outcomes. It feels democratic. It feels like freedom. But everything outside the frame disappears. Let's start with politics. In many democracies, people grow up believing they have power through voting. Two candidates, two parties, a clear decision. But what if both parties serve the same corporate donors? What if the difference between them is in language, not in structure? You're told it's a high-stakes battle, but the system remains untouched. You don't get to vote on how money influences elections. You don't get to vote on whether the nation goes to war. You don't get to vote on the system that created those choices. And the most powerful option, question the frame itself, is never on the ballot. This happens in debates too. You're asked, should we increase policing or fund more prisons? Not, why is the system built on punishment in the first place? You're asked, should healthcare be private or public? Not, why are pharmaceuticals allowed to price insulin like diamonds? It's the same in media. You're asked to choose between liberal and conservative news. But both tell stories built on the same foundational assumptions, that capitalism is natural, that the state is neutral, that certain wars are necessary. And the real questions, who benefits, who sets the agenda, what's outside the frame, never get airtime. Because the frame isn't neutral. It's designed. In advertising, it looks like this. Do you want whitening toothpaste or enamel-strengthening toothpaste? Not, why does toothpaste need to be a branded identity product sold through emotional manipulation? In culture, it looks like this. Are you a rebel or a follower? Not, why is rebellion being sold back to you through a clothing brand? The trick is simple. Limit the range of acceptable opinions, and people will argue passionately inside the lines. They'll fight over a Veers B, while option C or Z is erased from view. That's how systems maintain power without force. They don't need to shut you up. They just need to keep you talking inside the maze. Censorship by noise. Most people think censorship means silencing a banned book, a blocked website, a dissident dragged off screen, something you're not allowed to see. But in the modern world, the most effective censorship doesn't hide information. It buries it, not under lock and key, but under noise. Too many voices, too many headlines, too many distractions, all shouting at once. The goal is no longer to suppress the signal, it's to drown it. Let's look at how this works. During the Arab Spring, citizen journalists and activists used Twitter to spread images and stories the mainstream media wouldn't cover. But as regimes adapted, they didn't always shut these posts down. They flooded the hashtags with spam, propaganda, and irrelevant content, videos of cats, celebrity news, random gibberish, until no one could find the original material. The message wasn't deleted, it was buried under garbage. This is censorship by noise. And it's not limited to authoritarian regimes. In 2016, after the US election, it became clear that massive disinformation campaigns had been launched, not to convince people of one story, but to confuse them with thousands. Fake news articles, contradictory narratives, hyper-partisan headlines, all designed to make it impossible to tell what was real. This is called the fire hose of falsehood model, coined by researchers at Rand Corporation to describe propaganda that overwhelms rather than persuades. The aim isn't to replace the truth, it's to make truth feel irrelevant, incomprehensible, exhausting. Because once people are overloaded, they check out. And once they check out, power doesn't have to hide, it can operate in plain sight. Here's the deeper trick. People assume that access to information means freedom, but information alone isn't liberating. In fact, information without structure can become a prison. If you hear 10 versions of the same story, 5 contradicting statistics, 3 theories, and a flood of opinion pieces, what do you believe? What do you do? Most people default to the narrative that feels familiar, or stop engaging entirely. They scroll. They shrug, they retreat into apathy, and that apathy is perfect for those in power. Censorship by noise doesn't make you ignorant, it makes you numb. Even social media platforms amplify this problem. Algorithms push what performs, not what matters. Outrage, spectacle, distraction. Important stories get buried under trending nonsense. Urgent information is surrounded by viral jokes, celebrity gossip, and corporate ads. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because profit prefers noise. And once noise becomes the norm, silence doesn't feel oppressive. It feels like peace. And people stop asking what got lost in the static. When satire is a weapon, laughter is supposed to be a release. A way to challenge power, to deflate hypocrisy, to say what can't be said in serious tone. Satire at its best is rebellion disguised as comedy. But when power co-opts satire, it stops being a weapon against authority and becomes a weapon for it. Because what you laugh at, you stop taking seriously. Let's start with the basics. Satire is double-edged. It ridicules, it exposes, but it also creates distance. When a corrupt politician is turned into a cartoon, their actions lose weight. When oppression is reduced to a punchline, its victims become characters, not people. And over time, the laughter doesn't just blunt outrage, it replaces it. That's the first danger. Satire defangs the unacceptable. Take The Daily Show or Saturday Night Live. Both have mocked U.S. wars, presidents, economic collapse. But they've also trained audiences to experience politics as entertainment, to expect the absurd, to laugh instead of act. Over time, dysfunction becomes spectacle, and once it becomes spectacle, it feels normal. You don't fix the system, you roast it, you meme it, you go back to scrolling. Now take this global. In Russia, state-approved comedians routinely mock government critics, human rights advocates, or Western journalists. Not through arguments, through parody. The message isn't they're wrong, it's they're ridiculous. And ridicule sticks deeper than rebuttal. Once someone becomes a joke, they lose credibility without a single fact being challenged. And here's the trick: you can discredit truth without ever denying it, if you make it funny. Even extremist groups use satire. Far-right influencers often couch violent ideologies in irony, racist jokes, Nazi memes, conspiracy parodies. When called out, they hide behind humor. It was just a joke. You're too sensitive. Can't you take a meme? This is called weaponized irony. It lets people spread dangerous ideas without consequences because they're always one step removed from sincerity. And once you normalize speech through satire, you change what people feel safe saying in earnest. Think of it as plausible deniability in punchline form. You can nudge boundaries, float dog whistles, test reactions. And if someone pushes back, you just laugh and say they're overreacting. It's not just misdirection. It's propaganda wrapped in a smirk. The philosopher Theodor Adorno warned about this decades ago, that under mass media, culture would shift from reflection to repetition, from criticism to performance, and that the effect of laughter when consumed passively isn't liberation. It's sedation, because when everything becomes a joke, nothing feels worth fixing. Surveillance makes you self-censor. Censorship doesn't need a censor. Not when people do it to themselves. That's the genius of surveillance. It doesn't just watch you, it changes you. You start to anticipate being seen. You start to monitor your own thoughts, your words, your movements, and slowly you stop needing a warning. You've already edited yourself. Let's begin with the psychological core. In 1975, psychologist Charles Fried described privacy not as secrecy, but as the ability to control what parts of yourself are revealed. Without that control, your inner world becomes exposed. You can't experiment. You can't speak freely. You can't learn. You become careful. And careful people don't think freely. That's the goal of surveillance as a tool of control, not to punish what you say, but to make you afraid to say it in the first place. In the early 2000s, when the NSA's mass surveillance programs were revealed, many people responded with indifference. I have nothing to hide. But that's not how surveillance works. The point isn't catching criminals, it's reshaping behavior. Research from the University of Oxford found that when people believe they're being watched, even anonymously, they're less likely to search for controversial topics, even purely academic ones. Interest in terms like terrorism, privacy, and Islam dropped significantly after surveillance leaks. No law was passed, no arrests made, but curiosity shut down. That's self-censorship, and it's happening every day. In workplaces where emails are monitored, employees avoid saying things that might be flagged, not because they're unethical, but because they're afraid. On social media, people hesitate to like posts that might be controversial. Even in private chats, there's a sense that someone somewhere might be watching. This is the panopticon effect, first described by philosopher Jeremy Bentham and later expanded by Michel Foucault. It's the idea of a prison where inmates never know if they're being watched, but must assume they might be. So they behave as if they always are. The result, you no longer need a guard. The prisoners guard themselves. And in digital life, the panopticon is everywhere. Your phone tracks your location. Your apps listen for keywords. Your browsing history is stored. Your facial expressions, your typing speed, your sleep habits, all logged, analyzed, sold. Not necessarily to control you directly, but to shape what you see, what ads you get, what news you're fed, what behaviors are rewarded. And over time, that shaping becomes a feedback loop. You learn what gets punished. You learn what's safe, and the edges of your expression shrink without anyone having to say a word. The scariest part, it doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like being reasonable. Trauma bonds to authority. Not all loyalty is earned. Some of it is beaten into place, through fear, through confusion, through trauma. And once it's there, it becomes one of the most powerful tools of control. This is the mechanism behind trauma bonding, when a person forms intense emotional loyalty to an abuser, not despite the abuse, but because of it. The more unstable the environment, the more the victim clings to whoever seems to have power, even if that power is the source of their pain. What's disturbing is how often this personal dynamic gets scaled up into propaganda, politics, and national identity, because systems can do what abusers do: create fear, provide safety. Repeat. Let's break it down. In abusive households, a child learns that love is conditional, that comfort comes after pain, that survival depends on anticipating the moods of the one in control. So the child learns to adapt, to stay small, to appease, to love the source of their suffering. And they call it respect. Now take this into the realm of state power. After 9/11, millions of Americans experienced collective trauma. The fear was real. The grief was overwhelming. But before the shock could settle, the government stepped in, not just with comfort but with authority. Trust us. We'll protect you. You're either with us or against us. Civil liberties were stripped away. Wars were launched. Die-ends was framed as disloyalty, and most people went along with it. Not because they were stupid, because they were afraid. And fear rewires the brain. When people are traumatized, they don't want nuance, they want certainty, safety, clarity, and the hand that offers it, even if it created the crisis, becomes the hand they trust. This is how emotional dependency on authority is formed. North Korea is an extreme case. Citizens are bombarded with hardship, starvation, punishment, and then shown images of the supreme leader as their only source of safety. The pattern is clear. Pain, then praise. Fear, then gratitude. You survive because of your leader, even if he's the one who made you suffer. That's trauma bonding on a national scale. But it happens in subtler forms everywhere. When abusive police forces respond to protests by saying, "We're here to protect you." When religious institutions cover up harm, then offer forgiveness. When governments cause crises, then campaign on fixing them, the cycle continues. And the victims learn to mistake control for care. Because when someone hurts you and then tells you they're saving you, it feels safer to believe them than to face the betrayal. And once that bond is in place, it's hard to break. Even when the abuse continues, even when the lies are obvious, because trauma doesn't make people question authority. It makes them crave it. The dopamine trap of agreement. People like being right. But more than that, they like feeling right, safe, validated, understood. And every time someone agrees with you, shares your post, claps at your opinion, or nods in approval, your brain rewards you. Literally. With dopamine, the same neurotransmitter behind addiction, reward, craving, and reinforcement learning. The same chemical that keeps gamblers pulling levers, teenagers chasing likes, and lab rats pressing buttons. It tells you, that felt good. Do it again. And that's how agreement becomes a drug, one that can be engineered, repeated, sold. Let's break it down. Every time you post something online and someone agrees, with a like, a comment, a heart, or retweet, your brain gets a hit. Small but noticeable. Studies show these digital affirmations activate the same neural reward centers as eating sugar or receiving money. But unlike food or cash, agreement can be manufactured. Algorithms learn what you like, what you engage with, what makes you feel right, and then they give you more of it. More posts that confirm your views, more creators who sound like you, more content that tells you, yes, you see the world correctly. The result is a positive feedback loop, not just of content, but of self. You stop feeling curious, you start feeling sure. Now, zoom out. Entire platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, are built to maximize engagement. And what drives engagement better than agreement? Outrage helps, yes. But it's the agreement on top of outrage that makes people stay. You see something that angers you, your community agrees. You feel righteous. You return for more. And slowly dissent starts to feel uncomfortable. Not because it's offensive, but because it disrupts your brain's reward cycle. Being challenged feels like a threat. Disagreement becomes friction. Ambiguity becomes exhausting. So you seek out agreement and avoid doubt. This isn't just personal, it's political. Authoritarian movements thrive on dopamine reinforcement. Propaganda doesn't always aim to persuade, it aims to flood the zone with emotional certainty. The leader is right. The outsider is wrong. You're part of the truth. They're part of the lie. The messaging is repetitive, simple, affirming, and rewarding. And once your brain gets used to that reward pattern, it doesn't just resist contradiction, it punishes it. You feel annoyed by nuance. You get bored by facts. You scroll past anything that challenges you, not because you disagree, but because it doesn't feel good. That's the trap. Dopamine doesn't care if you're right. It only cares if you're rewarded, and once your beliefs are tied to your reward system, you're no longer reasoning. You're chasing a chemical. Polarization is profitable. It's easy to believe that polarization, political, social, cultural, is a problem. It tears communities apart. It turns friends into enemies. It fills comment sections with rage. It makes civil conversation feel impossible. But here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Polarization isn't just a side effect of modern life. It's a business strategy. Because division isn't just emotionally addictive, it's economically efficient. Let's start with media. In theory, journalism is supposed to inform. But in practice, news organizations need attention to survive. And attention is easiest to capture when you're angry, threatened, or disgusted. So what works best? Conflict. Identity. Simplified moral battles. You're not just reading a headline, you're choosing a side. You're not just watching a story, you're watching your people win or lose. Every article becomes a loyalty test. Every anchor becomes a surrogate for your worldview. Outrage sells. And over time, neutrality looks boring. Balance looks weak. The center doesn't keep the lights on. This is why outlets tailor the world to their audience's bias. Fox News tells one story. MSNBC tells another. Social media lets you choose your flavor of moral panic, and all of them are optimized for engagement, not truth. Now let's talk tech. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok don't care what you believe, they care how long you stay. And what keeps you glued to the screen? Rage, rivalry, identity warfare. The algorithm notices when you comment more on political content, when you pause on a culture war clip, when you scroll slower on something that annoys you, and then it feeds you more of it. Not because it hates you, because it's doing its job. To the algorithm, polarization is performance. If you're furious, you'll click. If you're afraid, you'll share. If you're surrounded by people who disagree, you'll retreat into echo chambers and double down. Every reaction you give is data. That data becomes prediction, and prediction becomes profit. Even politicians exploit this logic. It's easier to rally voters by naming enemies than proposing policy. It's faster to raise money through fear than through facts. Division energizes a base, and if the system rewards outrage, you don't need to build coalitions. You just need to keep your side angry. The result is what scholars call negative partisanship, not supporting your party because you love it, but because you hate the other side. And once hatred is the organizing principle, compromise looks like betrayal. And this division isn't accidental. It's incentivized. Because once people are polarized, they're easier to manage. They spend more, share more, argue more, fear more, and most importantly, they stop looking up. They stop questioning the structure that profits from their division because they're too busy fighting each other. Shaming is social engineering. Most people think of shame as personal. You did something wrong. You feel exposed. You want to hide. It's a private emotion. But shame isn't just personal, it's political. And in the hands of systems, governments, media, institutions, social groups, it becomes a tool of social engineering, not through punishment, through humiliation. Let's start with the psychology. Shame is one of the most powerful behavioral forces in the human brain. Neuroscientists have found that the experience of public shaming activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. It hurts, and because it hurts, we learn to avoid it. And that's the key. Shame teaches you to self-regulate. You don't just avoid bad behavior, you avoid being seen doing it. Now imagine that principle applied at scale. In authoritarian regimes, shame is used to control dissent. During China's Cultural Revolution, people were publicly denounced, paraded, and forced to wear signs listing their crimes. The goal wasn't to imprison everyone, it was to make an example out of some, so the rest would fall in line. You don't need a police state if people are too ashamed to speak, but even in liberal democracies, shame operates as a compliance tool. Think about how poverty is framed, not as structural, but as failure. Poor people are shamed for bad choices, for laziness, for not trying hard enough. So instead of organizing or protesting, they internalize blame. They hide. They apologize for struggling. And the system goes unchallenged. Now take this online. Cancel culture isn't about accountability, it's often about performance. A public takedown. A humiliation ritual. Everyone piles on, not to fix the issue, but to prove their own moral position. The person being shamed becomes symbolic. This is what happens to people like that. And what's the message to everyone watching? Be careful what you say. Shame doesn't just silence individuals, it teaches the group what not to become. Even schools use it. Report cards, behavior charts, public scolding, dress codes that target girls and minorities. The lesson is clear. Don't just follow the rules. Fear the spotlight. Don't be the one who gets singled out. Don't be the example. That's how shame controls behavior without open force, and it's incredibly efficient. Because unlike guilt, which is internal, shame requires an audience. It's social, which means it can be broadcast, weaponized, engineered by politicians, by institutions, by your peers. And once that structure is in place, you don't need to convince people to obey. You just need to show them what happens to those who don't. Glorification of the past. When the present feels uncertain, the past becomes a product. A simpler time, stronger values, heroes with clean morals, families that stayed together, borders that made sense, nations that stood tall. The story is always the same. Things used to be better. This is the lie of nostalgia and one of the most seductive tools of propaganda, because glorifying the past isn't about history. It's about control. Every authoritarian movement eventually turns backward. Make America great again. Return to traditional values. Back to the golden age. The past becomes a fantasy world, stripped of conflict, diversity, and contradiction. A perfect mirror where the dominant group sees itself as righteous, strong, and victimized by modernity. This fantasy isn't accidental. It's engineered. Real history is messy. It contains genocide, slavery, war crimes, censorship, and exploitation. But mythologized history turns all that into side notes, or erases it entirely. Colonialism becomes civilization. Segregation becomes tradition. Patriarchy becomes family values. And anyone who challenges the myth is seen as unpatriotic, immoral, or dangerous. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany glorified a mythic Aryan past, pure, rural, noble, to justify the oppression of Jews, Slavs, and the disabled. In the Soviet Union, Stalin rewrote Russian history to portray himself as heir to heroic national struggle. In post-colonial states, new regimes often rebrand former empires as glorious rather than brutal to maintain national pride. Why? Because a glorified past creates emotional loyalty. It tells people who they are and who they should hate for taking it away. And it works because the past can't argue back. It's silent. It doesn't move. You can dress it up however you want. Even democracies fall into this trap. Look at how U.S. history is taught. Founding fathers as saints, the Constitution as divine, every war as freedom's defense. Real critiques, genocide of Native Americans, the centuries of slavery, foreign coups, are minimized or reframed. The past is made noble, which means the present, by comparison, feels corrupted, and the future, dangerous. That's the real danger, because once people believe that history was morally superior, they stop fighting for progress. They want to go back, even if back means more inequality, more control, less freedom. Glorification of the past doesn't make people wise. It makes them obedient to an imaginary memory. And once that myth is installed, facts don't matter. Because nostalgia isn't a memory. It's a weapon. Science can be propaganda. We're taught to believe that science is the antidote to bias. It's rational, objective, self-correcting. Scientists test ideas, publish results, challenge each other, and over time the truth wins. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Science is not immune to propaganda. In fact, it's one of its most effective vehicles. Not because the method is broken, but because the system, the institutions, the incentives, the language can be manipulated. And when it is, the public doesn't see propaganda. They see a lab coat. Let's start with history. In the 20th century, scientific racism was used to justify segregation, sterilization, and genocide. Researchers published data claiming racial inferiority. Textbooks taught it. Politicians cited it. And it all wore the mask of science. It wasn't fringe. It was institutional. It was published, peer-reviewed, taught in universities. Wrong, yes, but powerful. Because it didn't look like propaganda. It looked like fact. In the 1950s, the tobacco industry famously funded scientists to downplay the risks of smoking. They didn't need to disprove the link to cancer. They just needed to create doubt. The doubt was enough to delay regulation and kill millions, and it was backed by studies. More recently, fossil fuel companies have used the same playbook: fund climate denial research, promote uncertainty, attack consensus, use the language of science to fight science itself, while insisting they're just supporting debate. And most of the public can't tell the difference, because science in public is a symbol. It signals authority, intelligence, trustworthiness, and that symbol can be weaponized. Here's how. Cherry-picked data, a real study is cited, but out of context or selectively reported to serve an agenda. Jargon, as camouflage, complex language is used not to explain, but to obscure. The average person can't decode it, so they defer to the speaker. Institutional capture. Industries influence what research gets funded, published, or promoted. Controversial findings are buried. Conforming ones get headlines. Appeals to authority. Instead of presenting evidence, institutions point to credentials. This is science becomes an end to the discussion, not the start of one. And the result? Propaganda with equations. Now, this doesn't mean science is useless. Far from it. The scientific method, when protected from manipulation, is one of the most powerful truth tools humans have ever created. But science isn't just a method, it's also a social institution. And like any institution, it can be bent by politics, money, ideology, or fear. So the next time someone says, "Trust the science," ask which science, whose funding, whose interest, because science can seek the truth, or it can sell it. The bias in what gets studied. Science is supposed to follow curiosity. Ask questions, test them, go wherever the evidence leads. But in reality, most scientific questions are never even asked, not because they're uninteresting, but because they're inconvenient. What gets studied isn't just about curiosity, it's about funding, risk, ideology, and power. And that's where bias begins. Let's take medicine. Diseases that primarily affect women are drastically under-researched. It wasn't until the 1990s that clinical trials in the US even required women to be included. Conditions like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, or autoimmune disorders received far less attention than male-centered problems, not because they're rare, but because they weren't seen as priorities. Why? Because, for most of modern history, default meant male. Now, look at psychology. For decades, studies were conducted almost entirely on Western college students, usually white, young, and middle class. But the results were generalized to all humans. What we call human nature was often just what American undergraduates do under pressure. And when psychologists studied other cultures, it was often through a colonial lens, as if deviation from Western norms meant backwardness, not difference. Even in AI research today, models are trained on datasets shaped by cultural bias, historical prejudice, and economic power. The results feel neutral, but only because the system defines neutrality as conforming to whoever built the dataset. This is the structural bias of research. It's not just what gets discovered, it's what gets decided is worth discovering. Take nutrition science. For decades, studies focused on fat as the main villain, largely influenced by industry-funded research from the sugar lobby, which quietly shaped the questions asked, the variables controlled, and the framing of conclusions. Entire national health policies were built on these biases. Or look at crime. Endless research exists on urban violence, gang behavior, and broken windows policing. But where are the billion-dollar longitudinal studies on white-collar fraud, corporate corruption, ecological crime by megacorporations? These questions don't get studied at scale, not because they're irrelevant, but because they threaten the wrong structures. And when no one studies something, it becomes invisible. It doesn't enter public conversation. It doesn't show up in policy. It doesn't spark outrage. The system quietly says, this is not a priority. And most people never notice that decision was made for them. The result? A map of knowledge shaped by silence. Funding shapes discovery. Science may search for truth, but money decides where to look. We're taught that researchers follow curiosity, that discoveries happen in pure pursuit of knowledge. But the reality is simpler and far more disturbing. Science costs money, and whoever pays decides the questions. Let's start with a basic fact. Most research doesn't happen in isolation. It needs labs, grants, equipment, staff, time, and publication. That means scientists must compete for funding from governments, corporations, universities, or private donors. And that's where the distortion begins. If a grant is more likely to be approved when the study aligns with a national priority, a political agenda, or a commercial interest, then those are the studies that get proposed. Those are the questions that get asked. Those are the outcomes that get reinforced. Let's look at pharmaceuticals. Studies that are funded by drug companies are far more likely to find favorable results for the sponsor's product. Not necessarily because researchers lie, but because studies are framed in ways that lead to preferred outcomes. Trials with inconvenient results may not get published at all. Others are spun with selective data, buried side effects, or cherry-picked timeframes. This is called publication bias, and it's one of the least visible forms of scientific distortion. But it's not just medicine. In agriculture, corporations like Monsanto or Bayer have funded research showing the safety of their chemicals while quietly discrediting independent scientists who raise environmental concerns. In climate science, fossil fuel companies have poured millions into institutes and journals designed to delay regulation, not discover truth, not through outright denial, but by promoting uncertainty, debate, and alternative explanations. And it works. Because the public sees a headline that says, experts disagree, but they never see the money behind it. Even government-funded research isn't immune. Military agencies like DARPA, or intelligence organizations, pour billions into science, not to explore freely, but to weaponize knowledge. If a study improves surveillance, prediction, or control, it gets fast-tracked. If it challenges power, good luck getting a grant. The distortion is subtle. No one says don't research that, they just stop funding it. No one says we need this conclusion. They just reward people who find it. Over time, researchers learn to self-select, to stay in safe territory, to chase the topics that are publishable, fundable, and institutionally rewarded. The result? Discovery becomes a market, and truth becomes whatever survives inside the economics of research. Health fads, as ideological trends, you think you're just buying a protein shake, or skipping breakfast, or detoxing, or cold plunging, or biohacking, or eating clean. But in reality, you might be buying an ideology wrapped in wellness. Because health fads aren't just personal habits, they're cultural scripts. And they say a lot more than eat better or feel stronger. They say who deserves to feel good, who has discipline, who's morally superior, and just beneath the surface, who's failing. Let's start with the pattern. Every few years there's a new must in health culture. Carbs are bad, then fats are bad, then sugar, then gluten, then seed oils, then all food after 8 p.m. Each trend comes with a wave of products, influencers, books, supplements, tech gadgets, and new social rules. And the science behind them? Often thin, often contradictory, often funded by whoever's selling the solution. But what's always consistent is this: health becomes a performance, not just about feeling better, about being better. And that's where the ideology creeps in. In Western culture especially, health fads often carry an unspoken moral logic. If you're sick, overweight, or tired, it's your fault. If you're strong, glowing, lean, you've earned it. Your body becomes a reflection of your virtue. And suddenly, broccoli is character. Sleep tracking is discipline. Smoothies are ethics. But this is not neutral. It hides class. It hides privilege. It hides marketing behind moral superiority. The people promoting these trends often have time, money, flexibility, access to fresh food, gym memberships, and clean air. But the system tells everyone else, you could have this too, if you just tried harder. This is how health becomes ideology. Individual choices are used to explain collective outcomes. Can't afford organic food. You're irresponsible. Struggling with weight. You're lazy. Not sleeping enough. Poor time management. Depressed. Bad mindset. Never mind the broken healthcare system. Never mind 60-hour work weeks, trauma, or food deserts. The problem, the system says, is you. And this opens the door for corporate exploitation. Products are marketed not just as tools, but as identities. This bar is keto. That app is biohacker approved. This brand is clean. And if you want to belong, you don't just need to eat right. You need to signal right. Even worse, health becomes apolitical. You spend so much time optimizing your morning routine that you forget to ask, why are so many people sick, tired, anxious, and poor in the first place? That's the real trick. Health fads make people obsess over their own bodies while ignoring the bodies around them. When natural becomes political. Natural sounds like a compliment. Natural food, natural bodies, natural parenting, natural gender, natural law, natural beauty. It sounds honest, clean, pure, uncomplicated. But when you look closely, natural isn't a description. It's a value judgment. And in the hands of ideology, it becomes a weapon. Because once you label something as natural, you don't have to defend it. You just have to imply that anything else is wrong. Let's take food. A product labeled natural instantly seems healthier. But legally, that word means almost nothing. In the US, natural foods can still contain pesticides, be genetically modified, and be processed. What matters isn't the ingredients, it's the story. You imagine sunlight, simplicity, wholesomeness. And companies know this. They use the word to sell identity, not nutrition. And behind that identity is often a subtle moral message. Natural food is good, artificial food is bad, If you eat poorly, you've failed morally, even if you live in a food desert. That's when language becomes ideology. Now let's look at parenting. Natural birth, natural breastfeeding, natural parenting. The language sounds empowering until it starts shaming anyone who deviates. C-section, formula, screen time, modern medicine. You're told you failed. You didn't do it the right way. Never mind your circumstances, body, income, trauma, or risk. The word natural gets used to police behavior, mostly women's. And it's rarely about health. It's about control. In gender politics, the phrase natural roles or natural order has long been used to justify inequality. Men are naturally leaders. Women are naturally nurturers. LGBTQ+ people are seen as violating nature. But these aren't biological claims. They're cultural enforcement, dressed in evolutionary language. Even violence gets justified this way. Colonialists claimed indigenous people were closer to nature, meaning less civilized. Racist theories said criminality was natural to certain races. Eugenics framed genocide as natural selection. Each time natural was used not to explain but to excuse. Because if something is natural, then resisting it is foolish, dangerous, immoral, and that's the power of the word. It seems harmless, but it's loaded with authority, tradition, fear, and exclusion. You don't need evidence, you just say, that's unnatural, and people stop thinking. Morality is shaped by biology. We like to think morality is a choice, that we reason our way to good and bad, that ethics come from philosophy, religion, culture, something conscious, something human. But the uncomfortable truth is this: much of your moral instinct isn't chosen. It's wired, not by a god, not by logic, but by evolution, hormones, and brain chemistry. Let's start with the basics. Studies in neuroscience show that moral decisions often occur before conscious reasoning. The brain fires emotionally, then explains itself afterward. You feel disgust, empathy, rage, and then you construct a rational story for why your feeling was justified. Your brain doesn't build a moral argument. It backfills one. Take the famous trolley problem. Do you pull a lever to kill one person and save 5? On paper, it's math. But the moment you're told you have to push a person to their death instead of pulling a lever, most people refuse, even though the outcome is identical. Why? Because emotional proximity activates different parts of the brain than detached reasoning. The moral logic hasn't changed. The biology has. Disgust works the same way. Studies show that people who are more easily disgusted are also more likely to hold socially conservative views, especially on issues like sexuality or immigration. Not because they've thought it through, but because their gut reaction is stronger and their brain then wraps it in moral language. Now look at oxytocin, the so-called love hormone. It increases bonding, empathy, generosity, but only toward in-groups. At the same time, it can make you less trusting toward outsiders. Your biology doesn't reward universal morality. It rewards tribal morality. That's how evolution shaped us. Early humans who trusted their tribe and feared strangers were more likely to survive. So our brains evolved to associate safety with sameness and danger with difference. And today that wiring still fires, even when it's completely irrational. It's why people feel morally outraged by foreign languages being spoken in public. It's why someone's outfit, hairstyle, or accent can feel wrong. It's not because it is wrong, it's because your brain treats unfamiliarity as threat. Now take that instinct, and imagine what propaganda can do with it. If a government or media system knows how to trigger disgust, fear, tribal loyalty, or moral panic, they can bypass your reason entirely. They're not persuading you. They're pulling biological levers, and your brain fills in the justification later. This is why dehumanization works. This is why fear campaigns work. This is why us versus them works. Because moral judgment isn't pure. It's a survival tool. dressed up in righteousness. And once you realize how much of your morality is hardwired, you have to ask, is this what I believe, or is this just what I was built to feel? Your brain fills gaps with fiction. Your eyes lie to you, so does your memory, your attention, your sense of time, your idea of who you are, not out of malice, but because your brain isn't designed to record the world. It's designed to construct a story, one that's coherent, efficient, believable, even if it's wrong. And that story, it's fiction. Let's break this down. When you look around, it feels like you're seeing everything. But your eyes only take in a narrow field of focus. Your brain fills in the rest, using past experience, guesses, context, and assumption. The result isn't reality. It's a simulation that feels like reality. This is called perceptual completion, and it's why magic tricks work. It's why visual illusions fool you. Your brain would rather guess wrong than admit uncertainty. Now take memory. We think of memory like a video file, but it's more like a Wikipedia page, editable, unstable, constantly rewritten. Each time you recall a memory, you don't retrieve it, you reconstruct it, add new details, blur others, sometimes even invent entire pieces to make it emotionally consistent. And you rarely notice. This is called confabulation, when your brain fills in missing information with plausible guesses and then believes them as fact. It's not a bug. It's how your mind maintains continuity, because gaps feel dangerous, contradictions feel threatening, so your brain edits the past to make the present make sense. Here's where it gets disturbing. If your brain is already filling in gaps with fiction, it's easy for propaganda to provide the script. Think about headlines without context. A photo, a half-remembered quote, a video clip. You don't get the full story. But you don't know that. So your brain builds one. And the more emotionally charged the content, the faster the fiction forms. Someone on your team is always innocent. Someone on the other side is always guilty. You saw what you needed to see, and your brain fills in the rest. This is why misinformation doesn't need to be sophisticated. It just needs to be suggestive. Give the audience a gap, and they'll write the rest. Even in politics and history, people often believe not what they were taught, but what they've inferred, what made sense given their upbringing, their social environment, their tribe, their emotional needs. Propaganda doesn't need to lie. It just needs to create emotional templates, patterns your brain uses to explain reality. And once those templates are installed, you fill in every blank with stories that match them, stories you believe you saw with your own eyes. But that never actually happened. False memories can be implanted. You might remember something that never happened. A childhood event, a conversation, a moment of triumph or trauma. You remember the smell, the color of the light, even what someone was wearing. It feels real, but that doesn't mean it was. Because memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. And under the right conditions, it can be rewritten by someone else. This isn't science fiction. It's experimental fact. In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus conducted a series of studies where people were told detailed stories about events from their childhood. Some were true, but one charm, getting lost in a shopping mall, was completely fabricated. The results? Over 25% of participants remembered the false event. Not just vaguely, they described it. The panic, the setting, the emotions. It didn't happen, but their brain built it anyway. This is called memory implantation, and it works not because people are gullible, but because the brain values coherence over accuracy. If a story fits your identity, your emotions, your expectations, your mind can absorb it as truth. Even therapy can unintentionally implant false memories. In high-profile cases during the 1980s and 90s, patients recovering from trauma began to recall events of ritual abuse or alien abduction under the influence of suggestive questioning, group reinforcement, and emotional priming. Some of these were later debunked, but the emotional damage was real. The memories felt vivid because they were constructed vividly. And once a false memory settles in, it's almost impossible to remove. Now imagine this mechanism used at scale. Mass media repeats emotionally charged stories, political groups share exaggerated claims, videos circulate showing partial truths. A narrator, trusted, passionate, authoritative, tells you a story that fills a gap in your belief system. It might not be true, but if it fits what you already fear, already love, already want to believe, your brain might just adopt it as memory. And over time, the details sharpen. You don't just believe the narrative, you remember it. You were there, emotionally. You saw it happen. You know someone who said so. You'll argue with conviction, because memory feels like proof. Propaganda doesn't need evidence. It just needs to be repeated with emotion. Once you remember something, even falsely, your identity wraps around it. You defend it. You filter new information through it. You tell others. You pass it on. And the false memory becomes cultural memory. Entire communities, even nations, can be built on things that didn't happen, stories implanted through repetition, imagery, implication, fear, and pride. That's the terrifying part. You don't just believe the lie, you live inside it. Obedience is a feature, not a bug. You'd like to think you would say no, that if someone in authority told you to hurt another person, really hurt them, you'd refuse. You'd walk out, you'd stand up for what's right. But in 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that shattered that belief, and it revealed something terrifying. Most people will follow orders, even if it means harming others. Even if it means watching someone scream. Let's walk through exactly how it worked. The setup was simple and completely fake, but the participants didn't know that. Milgram recruited ordinary people from all walks of life: teachers, postal workers, factory laborers, businessmen. They believed they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. Each person was assigned the role of a teacher. They were told they would be helping a learner, a man in the next room, memorize word pairs. Each time the learner got one wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock. The learner wasn't real. He was an actor. There were no shocks, but the teacher didn't know that. The shock generator was a real-looking machine with 30 switches labeled from 15 volts mild to 450 volts labeled XXX, danger, severe shock. With each mistake, the teacher was told to increase the voltage. The learner, the actor, followed a script. At 75 volts, he grunted. At 120 volts, he complained loudly. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. At 18 volts, he cried out that he couldn't take it. By 300 volts, he stopped responding entirely. The teacher, the real subject, would start to panic. Some laughed nervously, some shook. Some asked if they should stop, but the experimenter, dressed in a lab coat, calm and authoritative, simply said things like, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. No threats, no yelling, just quiet authority." And here's what happened. 65% of participants, nearly 2/3, went all the way to 450 volts. They believed they had just electrocuted a man into silence. They showed visible distress, but they obeyed, not because they were evil, because they had been trained by schools, jobs, the military, society, to prioritize obedience over conscience. And that was Milgram's conclusion. Obedience isn't a failure, it's a design. The system runs on it. And the scariest part, when asked afterward why they continued, most participants didn't blame the experimenter. They blamed themselves. "I was just doing my job. I didn't want to disappoint the scientist. I thought I had no choice." This is what makes obedience so dangerous. It doesn't require cruelty. It requires structure. A uniform, a clipboard, a chain of command. And once that structure is in place, most people will follow it, even if it means harming strangers, violating ethics, or abandoning everything they thought they believed. Obedience doesn't just enable atrocities, it normalizes them. Most people would shock you to death. Milgram. In 1961, Stanley Milgram discovered something horrifying. Most people, if told by an authority figure, would push a button they believed would kill a stranger. But the most disturbing part isn't the lab coats or voltage switches. It's the fact that you've seen this experiment play out in real life. Not once, not in theory, but again and again in history, in politics, in hospitals, in offices. Because Milgram didn't just expose something about the participants, he exposed something about how power works. Let's start with war. At the Nuremberg trials, after World War II, Nazi officers were asked why they participated in mass killings. Their answer was chillingly simple: I was just following orders. They weren't fanatics, they were clerks, engineers, doctors, trained conductors, and what Milgram showed decades later was that ordinary people in an ordinary setting could be conditioned to do the same thing. The implication: genocide doesn't require monsters, it just requires structure, a chain of command, a moral justification, a little distance from the harm, and someone saying, please continue. You see it in policing. A young officer follows a superior's instruction. Even when it involves excessive force, they hesitate, then obey. Not because they want violence, but because obedience is trained. Questioning is punished, and the system rewards compliance. And when someone dies, it's rarely one person's fault. It's the structure, 1,000 small yeses, stacked into a tragedy. You see it in healthcare. Doctors in totalitarian regimes have sterilized, tortured, and experimented on patients, not out of sadism, but because they were contributing to science, because paperwork was signed, because the hospital was state-run, because their job depended on not asking questions. And even today, in overstressed, underfunded systems, people fall through cracks. A patient is misdiagnosed, denied care, abused in a psych ward. Nurses know it's wrong, but they follow protocol. I didn't decide this. I just do what they tell me. There's nothing I can do. Everyday obedience, everyday harm. You see it in corporations. A middle manager lays off 100 people via email. A factory dumps waste into a river. A developer releases a manipulative algorithm. Everyone plays their part. Everyone follows the plan. No one touches the big picture, because no one is responsible for the whole thing. Milgram didn't just show that people would obey a lab coat. He showed that when you put someone in a system where responsibility is diffused, they will commit acts of harm that would horrify them in isolation. They don't feel evil, they feel normal. That's the scariest part. Most people would never shock you to death out of hatred, but many would do it if it came with a clipboard, a script, and a smile from someone in charge. Not because they're cruel, because they were taught that obedience is good. You defend the system that controls you. You might think that the people in power are the ones enforcing the system, but the truth is darker. The system defends itself, and it does it through you. You defend your nation. You defend your job. You defend the culture, the language, the religion, the rituals, the norms, even when they hurt you. In fact, especially when they hurt you. That's not a glitch, that's a feature. In psychology, there's a term for this: system justification theory. It's the human tendency to rationalize, defend, and uphold the very systems that limit or exploit us. In one famous study, women were shown 2 job candidates, one male, one female, with identical resumes. When told the male candidate would get paid more, they not only accepted it, they often justified it. They said things like, well, men have more experience. He probably negotiated harder. That's just how the world works. Even when the inequality was blatant. Why? Because confronting injustice is psychologically destabilizing. It's easier to believe the system is fair and that you just need to work harder, wait longer, be better. And that's exactly how control sustains itself. Through internalized loyalty. People in poverty defend capitalism. Victims of violence defend police. Workers defend employers who underpay them. Children defend abusive parents. Citizens defend governments that surveil and lie to them. And when someone questions the system, you're often the one who steps in to shut it down. Think about how people react when someone refuses to stand for a flag, or questions traditional marriage, or challenges the justice system, or criticizes their religion, or doubts the need for endless work. They're not arrested. They're shamed by their neighbors, mocked by friends, disowned by family. The control doesn't need to come from above. It comes sideways. This is why propaganda doesn't need to be constant. It just needs to be strong enough, early enough, and shared widely enough so that people enforce it on each other. A boy who cries is called weak, not by the state, but by his classmates. A woman who refuses motherhood is told she'll regret it, not by law, but by other women. An employee who speaks out about injustice is warned, not just by HR, but by coworkers. Control becomes culture. Culture becomes identity. And identity becomes loyalty. You don't need chains if people build their own cages and polish them with pride. The last propaganda is you propagandizing yourself. By the time you're old enough to question your beliefs, it's already too late. Not because it's impossible to change, but because the voice that resists change sounds like your own. That's the final trick of propaganda. You become its most loyal messenger. You tell yourself stories to justify everything you were taught. You repeat phrases you never truly examined. You suppress doubts before they fully form. You curate your opinions to be acceptable, not to be true. This is internalized propaganda, and it's the most effective kind. Because there's no one left to resist it. Think about how you react to certain ideas. When someone challenges your country's history, do you feel curious or attacked? When someone questions gender roles, do you listen or do you defend? When someone mocks your faith, do you ask why or do you flinch and push back? Your emotional reflexes aren't neutral. They were trained through repetition, through culture, through rewards and punishments, so early in life you don't even remember them. And now they feel like instincts, but they're not. They're installations. Propaganda doesn't just influence what you believe, it shapes how you believe. How much certainty you feel, how much contradiction you tolerate, how much discomfort you can handle before reaching for an answer, any answer that restores the illusion of safety. And once that mechanism is in place, you'll do the rest of the work yourself. You'll avoid books that challenge you. You'll click on headlines that confirm your worldview. You'll interpret ambiguity as proof of what you already think. You'll cut off relationships that question the story you're clinging to. And you'll call that growth. But it's not growth, it's maintenance. The system doesn't need to keep controlling you. Because you've learned to control yourself. And even now, listening to this, there might be a voice in your head saying, okay, maybe some people fall for that, but not me. That voice? That's certainty. That's the final propaganda. The one that whispers, you're already awake.